I'll give you guys a
Sorry.
couple minutes more, okay? So you can do your introduction, and meanwhile, I'll leave this on the board for the starting the jijikna, okay? So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, everyone. Welcome to Doctoral Dilemma. This is LWiC's second event. This event, as most of you know, is for guidance regarding PhD admissions. We have Sir Zaid with us. A brief intro for some. I'm pretty sure like 95% of all of you know who Sir Zaid is, but just a brief introduction. Sir Zaid is a LUMS alumnus of 2014. After graduation, he went on to do his master's from MIT in CDO. And now he came back and he taught us, like the batch of 2021 and 2022, for 2 years as a teaching fellow. And now he is pursuing his PhD at NYU Abu Dhabi. So Sir Zaid is somebody who knows the entire journey of being a LUMS student and going on to do a PhD really well. So without further ado, Sir Zaid, you can take over.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. ओके सो आई थिंक ज़्यादातर आप लोग सीनियर्स हो, एक आधा कोई जूनियर भी होएगा तो अच्छी बात है, उसको थोड़ा एक हेड स्टार्ट मिल जाएगा. बट रियली what you guys are telling me that less people are applying for PhD this year, I don't think that's a bad thing at all, because I think many of the students who do apply for a PhD do so without really knowing what they're getting into, why they're doing it, whether it's good for them or not. And that is what I want to talk to you about. पिछले जो 2 हफ्ते पहले जब अनुषा ने कहा था, और दूसरा जो सेशन था उसके लिए, तो she asked me about to give a session on the writing an SOP and the application process. And I said कि वो information तो आप लोगों को मिल ही जाती है generally लोगों से, एक जो procedural या कह लो क्या कहते हैं structural information है, मगर जो bigger question है why and whether, उसके बारे में I think is more important to talk about. So here's my starting point. Um, if you're not familiar with this website, phdcomics.com, go spend an hour there, and read all those different comics. They're very entertaining. Some of them you might not be able to relate to, but I promise that if you do end up doing a PhD, you'll end up relating to most of them. um, it's a very good look at, although it's a bit of a cynical and a pessimistic look, but it's a good look at at least what the difficulties of a PhD are like, right? So let me get started. I'm going to talk about three things today. One, what doing a PhD is like in detail. क्या मरहले हैं और क्या किन क्या कहते हैं सिचुएशन से आपको गुजरना पड़ेगा. दूसरा, what possible career paths exist after doing a PhD. And तीसरा, कि how to select a PhD program and or advisor. Okay, so we'll talk about these three things. What I want you guys to do is to write your questions out in the chat, because I have quite a long presentation. I think मेरा तकरीबन सवा घंटा 1.5 घंटा तो लग ही जाएगा सिर्फ to cover the content that I have for you, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. But I don't want to pause in the middle to take questions. So what you do is you write any questions that you have साथ साथ ही chat में, and after each of these three sections, when I get to the end of a section, then I'll take all the questions that have come up to that point. And then at the end, when if I have some more time, then I can take live questions, audio based questions from you guys. So yeah, so please जो सवाल हैं साथ साथ लिखते जाएं. I will eventually get to them. Okay, so first topic on the list, what doing a PhD is like. What does a PhD entail? We discussed this briefly in the previous session as well. पहले 2 साल ज़्यादातर आपका कोर्स वर्क ही होएगा. इन पहले 2 सालों में you won't have the tools necessary to conduct research, or most of the tools, and therefore there will not be a significant research output expected from you. And really, the goal of the PhD is to train you in order to become an independent researcher, somebody who can go from A to Z in terms of the research process on their own without any external help. And that is the product of a PhD, is a person who can do that, right? And in order to train you to do that, first they will give you the tools through coursework, through working maybe as a second author on a project, and through meetings and advice from your professor and so on, right? You'll have a qualifying exam or exams. Format will vary. Some universities will have a written one, some will have a कि अगर आपने एक paper publish कर दिया तो you qualify. Basically, it's just it's another hoop to jump through that tries to ensure that um, you're doing well enough for them to continue funding you and keeping you on as a PhD student, right? Um, Okay, so the main bulk of what your PhD is going to be is research, and research means basically exploring previously unsolved problems in the area that you're working in. And a structural part of that is publications. You write academic papers about your research and you send them to different public publications, either conferences or journals. Um, you can do internships during the course of your PhD as well. I would actually recommend that. An internship during a PhD, what does that look like? You temporarily stop working with your advisor and you start working on a shorter project with some other professor, or you start working temporarily on a shorter project in the industry. It can still be collaborative with your own advisor, or it can be a completely separate side project. But it gives you a broader perspective and it gives you an opportunity to look into something other than the main meat and bulk of your PhD. Okay, then there is your dissertation, which is your thesis, basically a compilation of all your research findings and convincing a committee that your work is sufficient, right? Because for a PhD, research does not really mean, Ma'am Mubin pointed this out last time, I think it was a very good point, that research is not just, okay, you can crunch numbers and you can, run simulations and you can analyze data and so on. There's a component to it which is an intellectually novel contribution, which is figuring out something, or determining something, or proving something, or hypothesizing something that hasn't been done before, right? So that's really the I would say the core the requirement of a PhD is that you do something novel. Okay, so research. What is research? The different component of research are, first you identify what are the problems that you want to solve. You formalize those problems. Yani ke maybe I have a very vague sort of idea about the kind of, maybe I want to. So I'll be using examples from my own field, which is transportation engineering, urban traffic management. So maybe my idea is I want to improve the way that cars are routing themselves within the city in order to decrease congestion, right? So I need to formalize that into a tangible objective with a scope, with variables, parameters. How do I measure the reduction in congestion? Is it through a reduction in travel time? Is it through a reduction in number of cars density on a particular road? Is it through greenhouse gas emissions and so on, right? So I need to define my objective, my scope. Am I talking about a city? Am I talking about the downtown area of a city? Am I talking about a certain week? Am I talking about only the rush hour during the day? What are the variables? What are the things that I can change? Basically, what are the tools, the levers that I have in which I can move around in order to achieve that objective? What are the different parameters, the environment that is around me that I need to take into consideration? So formalizing from a vague idea, okay, this is my problem, I want to solve it, to actually developing a mathematical framework in order to do that. Okay. And then you would develop new or improved methods to solve those problems, right? As methods that haven't been used before. Maybe you look at something I saw recently was कि physics का कोई phenomenon है जो कि fluids की flow में इस्तेमाल होता है to model fluid flow, and people took that and said, well, hey, let's try to apply this to traffic and see whether traffic can be approximated as a fluid moving through a pipe, right? Similarly, if you talk about CS, you have the example of genetic algorithms. So people saw things like, a swarm of bees and said that, hey, how do they decide where to go and where the flowers are, and how do they communicate it, and how do they find out the optimal location to build a hive or whatever, and how can we replicate that through our algorithms, right? So either you develop new methods, or you modify existing methods and apply them to different situations. And once you have a method, then you have to evaluate or prove the effectiveness of your solution, or that it's not effective, or other people's solutions. It's a contribution in its own right that you take somebody else's solution, and you prove that it does work or doesn't work, or how well it works, or what are the situations in which it won't work, and so on, right? And then there's testing solutions in real or simulated scenarios. So you deploy it, or you create an environment where you can test different cases of it, and so on. So those are really the key high level components of what research would look like. ठीक है? अच्छा. Since research is the main component of your PhD, I'm going to talk about it in a lot of detail. What are the good things about research? There's a joy of discovery, right? Because when you're solving a problem that nobody has solved, it's not always going to be very fundamental, right? You're the one who's cured cancer, right? But you might be the one who is looking at a particular um, क्या कहते हैं cause of cancer that can be partially mitigated in a certain way, right? So it's incremental. You're not going to most likely end up doing something groundbreaking, but you're going to be just pushing the envelope or the limit of human knowledge on a certain subject beyond what is already there, and that's really your novel contribution. And there's a joy of discovering something new. There's a joy of understanding how something actually works, उसकी तह में जाके और उसके fundamentally समझना कि वो actually किस तरह काम कर रहा है. There's an intellectual stimulation because you're working on new things all the time. You're working on interesting things, difficult things, complicated things. And for people who enjoy, really exercising their brain, there's an enjoyment in that. There's an autonomy, or somewhat autonomy, working on what you want to work on. Because a lot of time in the PhD, you can, to some extent at least, choose the kind of topics that you want to work on, right? So you choose what you want to study. There's no real core courses type thing. कोई खास नहीं होता. And then there's the joy of making an impact, right? So if you find out something, or if you develop something that's fundamental, that's very useful, a lot of other people are going to use it, and that makes you feel good. And or it could be used on the ground. It could be implemented. So if I develop a new scheme for timings of traffic light signals that reduces congestion, and I see that some city in the world is implementing that, and that has reduced their traffic congestion, that's a real world impact that I've made, right? Um, so those are some of the joys of research. What you'll see here is that this is a very nerdy list, right? And that's one of the takeaways that I want you to think about, that a PhD is for nerdy people. Okay? Basically, people who want to think, people who enjoy thinking, people who enjoy hard puzzles, intellectual challenges, and not for people who shy away from, or who don't like exercising their brains too much. Research has a lot of difficulties as well. A lot of difficulties. There are ups and downs severely. It's not like coursework at all. You don't have answer keys and you don't have grades. Answer keys na hone ka consequence kya hai कि you don't really know what the correct answer is. Nobody knows. Not even your advisor knows. Not even the world expert knows what the answer is, because if they did, it wouldn't be research. There are no grades, which means uska consequence ye hai कि you don't necessarily have a very objective feedback mechanism, right? So because if I'm doing a course, I give a quiz, I get marks. I know how I'm doing in that course based on the marks that I get. Then I give the exam, I get some get more marks. I do an assignment, I get marks. हर step पे मुझे एक feedback मिल रहा है about how I'm doing. There's an objectively measurable, quantifiable idea of my performance, and that really simply does not exist in research. You might get an idea from the sense कि मेरा पेपर पब्लिश हो गया तो चलो I'm on the right track, या मेरे एडवाइजर ने तारीफ कर दी तो I'm on the right track. But you don't have that all that often. Those are milestones that are few and far between, and are not as tangible as there are in coursework, right? You might not know whether a solution exists. You might not know whether your method will be an improvement, or whether it will even work or not, right? You might end up साल लगाया आपने नया मेथड डेवलप करने, और आपको पता लगा कि जो पिछला मेथड था उससे आपका मेथड बेहतर ही नहीं काम कर रहा, तो कोई फायदा नहीं हुआ उसका, right? You might put in a lot of work before coming to a dead end. आप बहुत कोशिश कर रहे हो एक चीज को प्रूव करने की, आपने साल लगाया उस पे, और उसके बाद वो प्रूव ही नहीं हुआ, या आपको कोई प्रूफ मिल गया कि ये प्रूव हो ही नहीं सकता, तो अगेन आपका काफी वक्त जो है वो जाया हो गया. You might end up solving something that somebody else has already solved in the meanwhile, right? So you might identify a gap in the literature कि भाई ये प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व की जा सकती है. जब तक आप उसको सॉल्व करते हैं और पब्लिश करने की कोशिश करते हैं, आपको पता लगता है किसी और ने उसको सॉल्व करके उतनी ही देर में पब्लिश कर लिया आपसे पहले, राइट? and you might not have data to test the hypothesis. You might, come up with a certain hypothesis and you want to test it, but you just don't have the access to data available, or the data might be incomplete, the data might be insufficient, and so on, right? So there's a lot of problems with data as well. um, so the goal of a PhD is to make you capable of performing research independently. What that means is कि शुरू में तो आपका advisor आपको help करेगा या hopefully करेगा या करेगी, but by the end of it you should be able to do the whole spectrum of what was on the previous slide, okay, from identifying a problem to formalizing a problem to developing a solution to testing that solution and evaluating it and so on. ठीक है. What are the skills you gain during a PhD? You learn how to define and formalize and reformulate problems. एक problem है, उसको एक तरह से हमने उसको formalize किया, उससे उसकी solution में कोई help नहीं हो रही, तो एक दूसरे तरह से उसको देख, मतलब looking at it through a different perspective, different lens. You learn how to evaluate the importance of problems. There might be 10,000 different unsolved problems in your area. Which ones are worth working on, worth spending time on, worth making effort to solve? You learn to evaluate that based on the knowledge that you gain. You learn how to extract relevant information from multiple sources, right? So you might read 1,000 different papers during the course of your PhD. You don't need to read all of them in such detail that you understand the nitty-gritty of how they're working. You need to understand what information is relevant for you, what information is irrelevant for you, what information you can use in your work, and so on, right? So extracting relevant information. आइडेंटिफाइंग नॉलेज गैप्स. सो बेस्ड ऑन आप अगर 10 पेपर पढ़ते हो एक एरिया में और आपको महसूस होता है कि ये इधर ये चीजें कर ली हैं और ये चीज नहीं की, राइट? सो दैट इज अ स्किल दैट यू पिक अप एज वेल. लिटरेचर पढ़ने से ये समझना कि भाई क्या चीज नहीं की गई, राइट? Contextualizing others' research, right? So a lot of people very often in academic papers, you will see people claim a lot of things that, we are the first person to do this, or we are the first paper to prove this, and so on. And a lot of times those claims are rather exaggerated. They're like siyasadano ke claims, right? So you have to evaluate the quality of the other people's research. You have to understand the significance of their findings, the limitation of their findings, the caveats and the pitfalls, and so on, right? So putting others' research in context, that is another skill that you gain. Developing a systematic approach to solving problems. I think this is a very important point because that is something that is very transferable as a skill, and that's something that definitely PhD people have as an advantage over others. That given any problem, they already have a pipeline in their mind as to how they would go about solving that problem, and that's very useful in general. Communicating the significance of your findings. No matter how good your results are, they're useless if you can't convince people that they are useful, right? So communication in terms of how you write your paper, communication in terms of how you present your finding at presentations, and so on, and how you network in order to make a name for yourself in the community. ये सारी चीजें आपको भी सीखने को मिलेगी. Teaching, because you'll do at least one TA-ship in your PhD. And as a senior PhD student who's close to graduating, you might even get to co-teach a course with your advisor. And yeah, so a PhD is more about, this is actually, while preparing this presentation, I got feedback from eight different current and former PhD students, मेरे batch के, मेरे से senior, मेरे से junior, from CS and EE, in order to make sure कि जो भी मैं आपको बता रहा हूँ is not a very skewed, personal experience, and is something that is corroborated by and backed up by other people as well. So it took me a lot of time to prepare this. पिछले 2 दिन से मैंने अपनी PhD का कुछ नहीं किया, but क्या कहते हैं, I think alhamdulillah, I've got a very diverse set of feedback from people. And one of the things that somebody pointed out very rightly is that PhD is not about being smart. PhD is about being persistent. PhD is about not giving up, because there are definitely going to be times when you have a lot of difficulty. Imposter syndrome is a very, very severe thing in a PhD. And you will have setbacks, and you will have to just jog on through them, and that's really the personal development, personality development that a PhD will give you. And if you're somebody who's, very sure that you won't be able to take difficult circumstances, then, you might want to reconsider, because there will be difficult circumstances. But if you do come through it at the end of it, that you'll definitely be someone who's much stronger in terms of not giving up in the face of difficulty. Okay, so what does the research process itself look like? You define your problem of interest. You review what is the existing literature. उस area में क्या-क्या चीजें की गई हैं, क्या-क्या चीजें नहीं की गई, क्या results, क्या studies available हैं. You collect and you process the data that you require to solve your problem. You design your experiment based on the data that you have. You conduct your experiment, whatever it is. You process your results. You write up those results in a paper. You submit that paper to a publication, and then they will probably most likely say this paper is not good enough for this reason. Please revise it and resubmit it to us. Then you'll revise it, and then if it's a conference, then you will go and present that paper in that conference, right? So that's a general overview of the research process. Obviously there will be different, there will be minor differences based on what kind of thing you're working on. Maybe you're working on a theoretical proof to a graph theory algorithm, right? So in that case, you won't really have an experiment in the classic sense, and you'll have more of a designing a proof. So this is just a generalized version of the research process for a quantitative problem. Okay, then there's the publication process, because that's very, very important. Your currency in research is basically publications, academic papers, right? And the magic of peer review is theoretically supposed to say कि मैंने अगर पेपर सबमिट किया है और उसको लोगों ने रिव्यू किया है और उनको लगा, एक्सपर्ट्स ने रिव्यू किया और उनको लगा कि सही है, तो वो सही ही होएगा. And therefore, it's supposed to be a self-correcting or a self-balancing mechanism whereby good things get approved and published, and incorrect or weak papers don't. It doesn't always work like that. It's very flawed system, as with any other system. But here's how the process in general works. You have to choose where to submit your paper, which conference, which journal. That's a very that's something that somebody in your position wouldn't have thought is an important or fundamental thing, but it includes a lot of different factors, and you learn about those once you start how to pick where to submit your paper. You write your paper. So this is the publication process. Means once you're done with your experiments and now you have something that you want to publish, you write your paper. Hopefully most of you have some exposure to LaTeX. If you don't, start learning LaTeX. An easy way to get into LaTeX is using Overleaf, which is a website that does not require you to download anything, and you can basically collaborate on your LaTeX projects. LaTeX, for those of you who don't know, is basically a word processor or a document writer like Microsoft Word, but it's specifically for writing academic papers. So all these papers that you see are written in LaTeX, or almost all of them. ठीक है. You format the paper according to requirements, because हर जर्नल की, हर पब्लिकेशन की अपनी रिक्वायरमेंट होती है कि 4 पेजेस जितना से लंबा नहीं होना चाहिए, या 10 पेजेस से लंबा नहीं होना चाहिए, 2 कॉलम होने चाहिए, ये होना चाहिए, वो होना चाहिए. बहुत सारी रिक्वायरमेंट्स होती हैं. दैट्स अ होल प्रोसेस. आपने किस तरह की टाइप सेटिंग करनी है, आपने रेफरेंसेस का फॉर्मेट क्या रखना है, एंड सो ऑन. Then you submit that paper. Typically conferences will have a deadline. So for example, you have a certain conference जो कि हर साल जनवरी में होती है, उसकी public उसके लिए submission deadline जो है वो जुलाई के end में होती है. So July 31st तक आपको वो paper submit करना है, वरना वो conference की उसमें consider ही नहीं होएगा. Right? Journals don't have a deadline because they're rolling. क्योंकि अगर आपने इस edition में नहीं publish submit किया, तो अगले edition में आ जाएगा. So that's more open-ended generally. So once you submit it, people will review it. It will be either professors or postdocs or sometimes even grad students. I actually reviewed a couple of papers even during my master's because my advisor asked me to. So दो या तीन, most likely तीन, मगर 2 से 4 लोग जो हैं वो आपके पेपर को रिव्यू करेंगे. They might take a long time. They might take a short amount of time, but generally once everybody has reviewed it, you'll get a decision, and that decision will either be that we accept your paper, or that we accept your paper but you need to do some kind of minor revision, or that you need to do some major revision if you want to publish it with us, or they will just say that your paper is not good enough, and that they reject it. right? So in most cases, you will not get accepted directly unless you submit a very, very good paper, or you submit to a rather weak publication. And you'll have to revise your paper. So you work on a revision. It can be multiple iterations. मैंने जो अपना एक ही पेपर सबमिट किया था मास्टर्स के बाद, उसमें मैंने एक दफ़ा सबमिट किया, उन्होंने कहा रिवाइज करो, फिर मैंने दूसरी दफ़ा सबमिट किया, उन्होंने फिर से कहा रिवाइज करो. And that process took about almost a year from my first submission to the point where they accepted it, right? So that there's multiple iteration. उस दौरान आप किसी और अगले project पे काम कर रहे होगे, right? But when your outcome, your reply comes, so then you uh, start working on that revision. ठीक है? Okay, so this is the end of part one. That was what doing a PhD is like. Next, we're going to talk about career paths after a PhD. अगर इस point पे किसी के सवाल हैं, so how do they measure your progress as a PhD student? Are you just judged by how much you're publishing in top conference or other metrics? Yeah, that's a very good question. Generally, as a PhD student, your advisor will be judging your progress, right? And he or she will be signing off every semester on how you're doing, whether it's acceptable or not. Your currency is mainly publications. So if you're publishing regularly, then your advisor will be happy, and you that means that, through the magical process of peer review, that means that you're contributing something worthwhile to the literature on that topic. There's caveats to that, of course. Some kind of work requires a lot more time before it can be published. Some papers are much more comprehensive. Some papers are more incremental and can be ready in a shorter period of time. So it's not just number of publications. It's you have to waiting by the quality and the amount of time that it will take. But generally, yes, your evaluation will be, and it's not a hard evaluation, it's a soft evaluation, will be on the basis of your publications. That said, um, the hard evaluation point is, that there are some milestones, which is basically you form a thesis committee, and when you've done a certain body of work, you present that to the thesis committee. They give you an idea of, okay, so this is what else you need to do in order to complete your dissertation. Then you do that. Then you ask them if you can, if it's enough for you to defend your dissertation. And well, if they say yes, this is enough work, then you start writing your thesis. Once you write your thesis, then you defend your thesis. And and generally your advisor will tell you whether or not you are you have achieved enough to go to the next step, right? So that will be a collaborative process with your advisor. um, yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So second thing is career paths after a PhD. PhD करने के बाद, what are the different options that you have, right? So generally you have the option of going into academia. Academia में 3 track होते हैं PhD के बाद. One is a tenure track, which is the most common one and generally considered the most prestigious one. All right. One is a teaching track and one is a research track, and we'll talk about each of them in a bit of detail. The other option is that you go into industry, and we'll talk about that as well. Right, so that's an overview about what you can do after your PhD. For a tenure track career path, basically what is a tenure track? A tenure track means an evaluation period for new professors. आप कहेंगे इतनी देर मैं PhD में evaluate होता रहा हूँ, उसके बाद मुझे अब evaluate करेंगे. So it's like a probation period, but आमतौर पे most jobs have a probation period for about maybe 3 months or maybe 6 months or 1 month or something. Tenure track is a probation period for new professors, and it lasts about 6 years. So क्या कहते हैं, when you complete your PhD and you're hired on a tenure track, basically वो करेंगे ये कि आपको 6 साल के लिए रखेंगे in a university, and during that time they will evaluate how good of a professor you are. And after 6 years, if you've shown enough to convince them that you're a very good professor, then they will say, okay, we trust you now, and we're going to let you stay in this job until you retire. So that's a very interesting thing, and that's a level of job security that you don't get anywhere else except in government jobs, public service jobs, and that's one of the key reasons why people want to get into academia, into tenure track academia, because for example, if you complete your PhD at age 30, you get tenure at 35, 36. अगले 25 साल के लिए आपकी job set है. That means you can't be fired for performance reasons. You can only be fired for disciplinary reasons, right? So उसमें अगर एक प्रोफेसर जो है वो 7, 8, 10 साल से लम्स में है, तो उसके बाद अनलेस वो खुद ही छोड़ के जाना चाहे, उसके अलावा उसको कोई निकाल नहीं सकता, चाहे वो कोर्स कितना मर्जी बुरा पढ़ा रहा है, राइट? It has its ups and downs. The spirit of the tenure track, the spirit of tenure is basically कि पहले 6 साल में आप प्रोफेसर को इवेल्युएट करो कि वो अच्छा है कि नहीं है. अगर वो इतना अच्छा है कि उसको ट्रस्ट किया जा सकता है, यानी कि उसको टेन्योर दिया जा सकता है, तो फिर उसको आगे जॉब सिक्योरिटी इसलिए दो ताकि now he has the freedom to work on whatever they want to work on without any pressure to publish or without any pressure to show output or results, right? So because they can now work on more fundamental problems, more difficult problems, more challenging, complicated problems which take a longer period of time and might not get results, right? Because if you're working on a more फंडामेंटल प्रॉब्लम, इट्स मोर रिस्की बिकॉज यू माइट नॉट गेट एनीवेयर, राइट? अगर मैं कोई इंक्रीमेंटल अपडेट करने की कोशिश कर रहा हूँ या थोड़ा सा कोई चीज इंप्रूव करने की कोशिश कर रहा हूँ, तो इट्स मच ईजियर टू गेट दैट काइंड ऑफ इंप्रूवमेंट एंड देयरफॉर टू गेट आउटपुट. बट इफ आई एम ट्राइंग टू रियली revolutionize a field or trying to develop a completely new theory, that's going to, number one, take more time, and number two, have a high risk of not working. So who do they give the trust to be able to work on that kind of problem without asking them for output constantly? Those are those people who have passed the tenure evaluation period, right? So if after those 6 years, if you don't get tenure, then either you are fired from the university or they will allow you to continue on a contract basis, which most people don't, because वो काफी बेइज्जती वाली बात होती है, consider की जाती है. So yeah, so that's generally tenure in a nutshell. So here's how and it's very competitive. Yeah, so this, I will tell you that in the US, for example, only about 1/5 of people who complete a PhD actually end up getting a tenure track position at a good university in academia, right? Because universities तो उतनी हैं, बहुत ज़्यादा तेजी से नई universities तो नहीं खोल रही अच्छी level की, और प्रोफेसर्स 30-30 साल उधर रहते हैं, तो ओपनिंग्स जो हैं वो बहुत थोड़ी होती हैं. हर साल PhDs निकल रहे हैं सैकड़ों की तादाद में. सो इट्स वेरी competitive to get a tenure track position at a top university. So here's how it will look like. You do your PhD, then you ideally get an assistant professorship, which is a tenure track professorship. But if for some reason your record isn't strong enough to get an assistant professorship or a tenure track position at university of the level that you want to be at, then you can optionally do a postdoc, which is called a postdoctoral associate position, which is basically working as a researcher for a couple of years, 1 or 2 years with a professor. You're somewhat, you're not a student anymore. It's like an employed position. It's like a research associate position, whereby you try to improve the weak points in your resume in order to then be able to get a tenure track position somewhere. Right. So typically, if you're applying, if you want to get a tenure track position at a very top level school, you might not have shown them enough during your PhD for them to give you that, and therefore they might क्या कहते हैं, ask you to you might have to do a postdoc in order to be competitive in that kind of position. So after you pass your tenure, you get promoted to associate professor. This is a generalized thing. You might get promoted पहले, even before you get tenure. अगर आप मिसाल के तौर पे 3-4 साल बाद क्या कहते हैं इतना अच्छा परफॉर्मेंस करते हो कि आपको वो प्रमोट करना चाहें, तो you can be associate professor without tenure as well. So but generally it would take about 6 years. Then there's a final jump, which is to full professor, and you would make that only if you're a good associate professor. People can go all the way up to age 60 and retire without ever getting enough of a clout to become a full professor. It's really only the good ones who will make it to full professor. Okay. What does a job at a university look like for a professor? You will have to teach, obviously. You'll have maybe 3 courses a year or something. You'll have to pursue research and publish papers. You'll have to get grants, which means funding basically from external sources in order to fund your research. You might need that for equipment. You might need that for conducting experiments. You might need that for hiring research assistants and so on. And you serve on convening committees. So you review different papers that are submitted to your journal. You if you're on a convening committee of a journal, you will basically be making the final decision about whether papers are accepted or not, and so on, right? So those are within the research community, that is considered something that everybody has to do some of in order for the publication system to work. You would do some advising, undergrad, senior projects, MS thesis, PhD dissertations. You would advise students, and you would do some kind of service. So you're part of some university committees like admission committee, disciplinary committee, curriculum design committee, student affairs, and patronship of societies, and so on. So those are the different responsibilities of a tenure track or tenured faculty member at a university. Now, I said that there are two other tracks within academia. One is an academic teaching track, which is basically somebody who doesn't necessarily want to do research, but who wants to teach, only teach or mainly teach. For them, the track would look like, after a PhD, you're a lecturer or a teaching fellow or something like that. And then you progress to being a clinical professor or a teaching professor. Those two words mean the same thing. So you could be assistant teaching professor, then you could be associate teaching professor, and full teaching professor, and so on. So it's a different track. You don't get tenure in that track, but you can get renewed on a 5-year rolling contract basis or so on. So your responsibilities in that track would mainly be teaching and service. There's an academic research track, which is the other end of the spectrum. So in a tenure track, you're doing both things. In an academic track, you're mainly teaching, and on a research track, you're mainly doing research. Working as a research professor at a university. So you start as a research scientist or a research assistant professor, and then you have that progress to research associate professor, and so on. And you have mainly research and advising responsibilities, but this is only available at certain research intensive universities. So a university that is doing a lot of research in a certain area might hire research professors in that area. Then there are industry research positions. This is something that a lot of people sort of overlook when they are thinking about whether to do a PhD, but it's very common for people to go into the industry as a researcher after doing a PhD, because it's not just academia that needs researchers, it's industry as well. And if you're talking about CS or EE, so khas taur pe, these big tech firms all have research wings, right? So Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, any of these, you name it, and they will have dedicated departments that are not doing anything to do with the core functionality of the products that they are selling, and instead that they are doing research on whatever technology is needed or potentially going to be needed for the potential future directions that the company wants to go in, right? So if you're talking about Uber, they will have an entire research wing of PhD qualified professors working, you wouldn't call them professors, but PhD qualified doctors working on the next generation of technology for self-driving cars. In Google or Microsoft or Facebook, you would have a lot of PhD people working on all sorts of things that company wants to get into in the future, right? So these positions are less competitive than the academic tenure track because there are more openings available. There's simply more demand for people in these positions, except at the very, very top. In the very, very good companies, you still, of course, everybody wants to go there, so it's competitive. And it's more lucrative than academia. It pays much better than academia generally. And the research that, I think, how do I get rid of this part? Just one second. Here we are. Yeah, where was I? Yeah. So yeah, uh, it's more practical or application based than academia, which is generally more theoretical or more idealized scenarios that you're talking about, right? But I would advise you to look into do a little bit of research about what kind of research positions exist in industry, what kind of work they do, and and that might interest you, because some people, they like research but they don't like teaching, and they might think, I can't get away from teaching after a PhD, so why should I do a PhD? You can definitely still do a PhD and get into research positions in industry and have nothing to do with universities after that at all, if you don't want to. Yes, that was the second part about career paths after a PhD. I think Anusha had a question. The issue with sharing a screen is that you can't see the chat. I still haven't figured out a way to be able to constantly see the chat, on the side. Just aamtaur pe you guys can probably see the chat on the side. It's docked, but I can't while I'm sharing the screen. If somebody knows how to do that, please mujhe bata do. Isn't tenure bad for the quality of education, or do people get enough teaching experience during their PhDs to be trusted with this? Good question. You guys can answer that yourself based on the quality of professors that you see. Generally, do you find that younger professors, younger instructors are better teachers, or do you find that tenured professors are better teachers? That's a hypothetical question. Don't answer that here. But yes, I agree. Tenure is definitely bad for the quality of teaching, not necessarily for the quality of research, because the main purpose of tenure is to see whether somebody is trustworthy enough to give them the freedom to do research without having to judge them all the time, right? But what that does lead to is people who end up not really caring about their um, teaching and their courses too much, um, which is why there is a separate teaching track that exists. Um, but yeah, it has pros and cons, and it's not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. Okay, so third part, which is probably what you guys are most interested in, which is how to select a PhD program and advisor. Okay, so we talked about this last time, how to select universities. So I suggested that you should choose about 5 to 10 universities to apply to. I heard, I don't know who told me, but I heard that people are applying to about 20 universities each. That's ridiculous. I think that's a wastage of money, because you're only going to go to one. Why are you applying to 20? You should just this is what I showed you last time. Okay, you make a number of bands. I would say 4 bands generally, about what kind of likelihood of acceptance you have in different universities, based on their ranking and based on their acceptance rate. There's a very good website called csrankings.org, which you can look at for. I have the link on the next slide, which you can look at for evaluating the ranking in the particular area of your choice. So not just CS in general, but for example, you want to get into machine learning, or you want to get into graph theory, or you want to get into software defined networks or whatever. So you can look at how good each university is in that particular area, and then use that as uh, your first order sorting criteria, to look at and then you can see the acceptance rates on their websites, or email them to find out what percentage of people do you accept for PhD in this department every year. um, a PhD admission is very different from a master's admission. Like I said last time, that a master's admission is going to be based mainly on your academic record. There's a quantitative way of judging whether one applicant is better than the other. But in a PhD, it depends very heavily on what you're interested in working on, and the availability that different professors who are working in that area have in order to take new PhD students, right? So within each of these bands, ideal scenario, I definitely want to go to these universities, but I don't think I'll get in. I would be happy to go to these, but it's still not very likely that I'll get in. I'm okay with going to these, and it's somewhat likely that I'll get in. I don't really want to go here, but I'll definitely get in. So these are the 4 categories I would think that you make. in terms of decreasing order of difficulty of getting in based on their ranking and acceptance rate and so on in your area of interest. Um, and then within that band, you select some universities um, based on a lot of other criteria, which I'll talk about in detail in the next slide. So ये मैंने सारा कुछ पिछली दफा भी बताया था generally, but this is what I didn't talk about in detail last time. कि बाकी criteria क्या है? How do you, as a PhD applicant, how do you choose which universities to apply to? So, for example, आपका ये जो, so suppose that for you with a GPA of about 3.6, for you this long shot would be 1 to 5. This or with 3.6 would probably be 1 to 10, right? That would be long shot. And then this would be 10 to 20, this would be 20 to 30, and this would be somewhere below 30. But how do you, so if you have 10 over here, right? So आपने तो total 10 में apply करना है. Please don't apply to more than 10. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. There's no point in applying to so many different places. If you follow this spectrum, you'll have कहीं ना कहीं तो आपका हो ही जाएगा. So don't apply to 20 places. If there are 10 universities in this one, you're not going to apply to all 10. You're going to apply to 2 of them, maybe, right? So how do you choose which 2 out of those 10 to apply to? There's a lot of different criteria for selecting that. Number one, you look at how strong that university is in your area of interest. So suppose there's MIT, Stanford, CMU, and क्या कहते हैं, Berkeley as the top 4, right? Well, and you want to apply to just one of them. So how do you choose which one? You look at how strong they are in your particular area of interest. This is the website CS rankings that you can count the number of faculty members they have in your area of interest, right? So LUMS might be very strong in networking, and LUMS might not have too many faculty members in machine learning, for example. So somebody who wants to do machine learning, they might see that LUMS is the best place in Pakistan for doing a PhD, but if they want to do machine learning, they might not get a very good experience. Maybe some other university has more machine learning faculty or better machine learning faculty than LUMS does, despite LUMS having an overall better ranked department, right? So similarly, in the US, you will see that a good university, a university with a higher rank, is not necessarily unilaterally or homogeneously better than a university with a lower rank in every different area. All right. You check the publication, number of publications, citation counts, H index, वगैरह. If you guys don't know what this means, go look it up. You need to know about these metrics. Scholar.google.com. And you look at how strong those faculty members are. Actually, CS rankings probably gives you a comprehensive view of all of this put together. You ask people in the research area. So if you're thinking about getting into networks, you would go to LUMS professors who are working in networking and ask them about how strong is this university in this particular area, how strong are these professors in this particular area, and so on. You look at how many professors there are that you would be interested in working at. So suppose मैंने decide करना है in top 4 universities में से किसी एक में apply करना है. अब मैं जाके देखता हूँ कि मेरे एरिया ऑफ, सपोज माय एरिया ऑफ इंटरेस्ट इज मशीन लर्निंग, मैं देखता हूँ कि MIT में 4 प्रोफेसर हैं इस पे काम कर रहे, CMU में 5 हैं, बर्कली में 3 हैं, और स्टैनफोर्ड में 6 हैं, राइट? But within that, how many of them would I be interested in working with? And that is a very important criteria for you to decide. You count the number of active faculty members whose interests overlap with yours. Maybe one of them is working on, some of them are working on very theoretical aspects of improving machine learning algorithms themselves, and others are working on how to apply machine learning algorithms to healthcare applications. Others are working on how to apply them to other applications. So what kind of stuff are you interested in? Go look up the faculty members, look up their pages, look up their research interests, and make keep an Excel sheet of हर university में कौन से faculty members हैं who you'd be interested in potentially working with. अगर ज़्यादा हैं तो that increases your chances of admission, because then when you write your SOP and you say कि यार इस बंदे के साथ मैं potentially interested हूँ काम करने, अगर एक ही बंदा है तो फिर उस एक बंदे ने अगर आपको रिजेक्ट कर दिया या किसी वजह से उसके पास फंडिंग नहीं है, उसने नए बच्चे नहीं रखने इस साल, तो फिर आपको कोई खास फायदा नहीं होएगा, आपका एडमिशन या तो नहीं होएगा, या आपका एडमिशन हो भी जाए तो you'll have to work with somebody you don't want to. So it's better to apply to those places which have multiple professors who you'd be interested in working with. हो सकता है आप उस advisor के पास जाएं, आपके उसके साथ ना बने, अब आपके पास कोई option ही नहीं रहा दूसरा. If you want to continue working in that same area, but there's no other professor, you can't switch to some other advisor, right? So इस तरह की चीजें जो है वो आपको फायदा होता है अगर ज्यादा प्रोफेसर्स हों. उस पर्टिकुलर लैब या ग्रुप का रेपुटेशन कैसी है, यू लुक एट देयर प्रोजेक्ट्स, उनका वेबसाइट देखो, उनकी पब्लिकेशंस देखो, उनके अलमनाई जो हैं वो किन यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में काम कर रहे हैं या किन फर्म्स में काम कर रहे हैं इंडस्ट्री में आफ्टर ग्रेजुएटिंग. And again, you can ask somebody in the research area as well. So some universities might have some very strong groups in particular particular research centers. Okay. Then you have how many other faculty or students are in the lab, right? So if you're applying to a particular lab, you suppose you're applying to जैसे जैसे LUMS में you have this क्या नाम है अपना, I keep forgetting the name, जो डॉक्टर फरीद ने शुरू की हुई है, जो somebody tell me the name, यार.
TPI, sir?
Yeah. So I keep thinking of it as TPP. Yeah, so TPI may, there's a couple of faculty members involved, right? So how many students are there? If you're somebody who's interested in technology policy type program and you're looking at LUMS TPI as a potential place to go, उसमें कितने लोग हैं, अगर ज़्यादा लोग हैं तो there's more resources, more people for you to learn from, to collaborate with. I guess this is similar to the previous point as well, but generally you want to be in a place where there are a good number of people working on stuff that you're interested in working on, or similar stuff to what you're interested in working on, because then you have more collaboration opportunities, more learning opportunities, more backup opportunities to shift if you need to, and so on. Right? Another very important thing is, what is the graduation rate of PhD students, right? So some universities might have a very low graduation rate, which means कि उनका PhD process इतना तगड़ा और इतना grueling or demanding है कि people end up dropping out, right? And you don't want to be going to those places. Let me tell you right now that the graduation rate on average in the US for PhD students is somewhere slightly higher than 50%. So almost half of people who start a PhD, who get admitted, accept the offer, go there, actually don't end up finishing it. Half, right? And that really shows you that, a lot of people, number one, that shows you how difficult it is. And number two, it shows you that a lot of people get into it without thinking it through as to whether they want to do it in the first place or not. So this is a good website to check that, Grad Cafe, or this is a good website to check for, admissions information in general. Or you can check the department website, or you can email the department to ask, what is the graduation rate for people who enter with a CS PhD for a CS PhD. कुछ यूनिवर्सिटीज की अच्छी बेहतर होती है, कुछ डिपार्टमेंट्स की ज़्यादा बुरी होती है. So you don't want to go to some place जहाँ पे it's significantly below average in recent years specifically. And then the very important question of funding. This is probably the thing that out of all the people who I showed this presentation to and asked for feedback, I showed it to a faculty member at university in the US as well. I showed it to several former LUMS students who are doing their PhD. One thing that they wanted me to emphasize a lot is about finances, right? I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But generally, if you're going to do a PhD, you're going to be compromising on money. You're going to be compromising on the financial side of things. And that's really, there's no two ways about it. That's a fact. You need to be okay with that if you want to do a PhD. That's a separate thing. Within the PhD, as you know, it's almost always going to be a funded enterprise. Nobody pays for a PhD, or almost nobody should pay for doing a PhD. But how does funding work, right? Typically, I talk about it in more detail on the next two slides, but generally you can check once you get an offer, right? So that offer letter will tell you you are guaranteed funding for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever, right? Or you can check on the website of the department, okay, we guarantee funding for new PhD students for this many years. You can ask the advisor or the department about funding as well. I'll talk more about funding in the next couple of slides. So does the location match your preferences? Again, this might be important for some people, might not be important for other people. Living costs आपने देखने होते हैं. Generally, your stipend is dependent on your living costs. So if you're in New York, you might get a stipend of about $3,000 a month. If you're in, uh, Purdue or something, you might get a stipend of $2,000 per month, but that's because Purdue may rent will be $1,000 cheaper. So it's similar standard of living that whatever stipend they give you is based on whatever, slightly higher than minimum wage. So you'll be earning slightly more than the person who you buy your takeaway naan from and salan from in the halal store down the road during your PhD. So the climate might matter. कुछ लोगों को सर्दी से बहुत मसला है, कुछ लोगों को गर्मी से बहुत मसला है. So on campus size and type, कुछ campuses जो शहरों में हैं, they might just be a collection of buildings within the downtown area. It might not be a separate contiguous campus, walled campus कह लो या अलग से campus. You might want, whatever. There's different things. If you're in a rural area, you might not have too many things to go out and do, but you might have some scenic opportunities to go and hiking and boating and whatever else. But that will depend on the kind of location you're at. So look at the geography of the area that you're applying to as well. Another thing is cultural openness, which means basically do they like brown people or not? Because in the US specifically, as you've probably seen if you've been following the election and Trump's presidency, there's a large disparity between rural urban areas in general and between different cities as well about how open they are, how welcoming they are, how racist they are, and so on, right? So generally you would want to, as a Muslim, especially as if you're a practicing Muslim, you would want to stick to places where you're not going to have trouble because of that. University campus पे तो आपको कभी नहीं मसला होगा, किसी भी campus पे कोई खास मसला नहीं होगा, मगर around the area, right? So if you're living off campus, if you're क्या कहते हैं, want to travel here and there थोड़ा बहुत, so उसमें थोड़ा सा फर्क होता है. And once you guys get admitted, you can talk to me more about individual cities if you want. Then there's Muslim community or Pakistani community. It might matter to you, it might not matter to you. If it does, keep it in mind that bigger cities generally have a better Muslim community or a bigger Pakistani community, because bigger cities have more immigrants, whereas smaller town areas have basically white people who have been living there for a long time. And since there are not too many economic opportunities, they don't have too many immigrants coming in. And similarly for halal food and whatever else, if that matters to you. Okay, let's talk about funding. So typically you'll get your tuition waived off, and you'll get a $2,000 or so stipend, and you'll get health insurance covered in some form or the other, or a mixture of different forms for a certain minimum number of years. What does that mean? There are different types of funding. So you can have a fellowship, an RA-ship, or a TA-ship, right? And what a university will say is कि भाई आपको किसी ना किसी तरह हम फंड कर देंगे कम से कम 3 या 4 या 5 साल के लिए. What does that mean? कि या तो हम आपको फेलो के जरिए कर देंगे, या तो हम आपको आरशिप के जरिए कर देंगे, या फिर आपको अगर हम इन दोनों में से कुछ ना दे सके तो आपको टीएशिप करनी पड़ेगी, मगर then we'll guarantee that you'll get a टीएशिप. Essentially what they're saying is कि you won't be left without funding in one form or the other. What you have to do for that funding is going to matter, is going to be different. You might have to sometimes do a TA-ship, sometimes do an RA-ship, sometimes do neither and get a fellowship, right? Typically, what a fellowship is from the university or from the department, and it's not dependent on any particular advisor or any particular project. And that allows you to work on whatever you want to work on. It's very, very competitive to get a fellowship that funds you for the entirety of your PhD. And that's what they give to their top applicants, right? So if I'm applying to a really top school, I might not get a fellowship. But if I'm applying to a lower ranked school, best guy who's applied there, they might say that, okay, you're the guy we're going to offer this fellowship to. You can come here and be funded from our department funds without being dependent on any particular advisor or project, right? Then mainly most people, almost, I wouldn't say almost all, but the bulk of PhD students are funded by an RA-ship, which is typically from your advisor, which means that your advisor has written a grant requesting a grant, he requests, the NSF, the National Science Foundation, or the Department of Defense, or other research funding agencies exist, or even the Gates Foundation or something like that. He will request them for funding to work on a certain project. They will give him funding, and that funding includes the ability to, or that funding, part of that funding is reserved for spending on the hiring of a PhD student or multiple PhD students, right? And therefore that professor will use that funding to fund you as a PhD student, and that's called an RA-ship, and that's going to require you to work on the general domain of whatever that funding was for, right? So if that funding is for finding kya kehte hain, a deep learning algorithm to solve X, then you can't work on solving Y instead if you want to, right? Because that funding depends on, they're going to have deliverables. They're going to ask the professor after 2 years, okay, you used our money to hire this guy to solve this problem. What have you done with it, right? And then he will show that ये हमने paper publish किया है, या ये हमने काम किया है और हम publish करने लगे हैं, या whatever else results आपके उसको दिखाने पड़ेंगे. So that's as a professor writing grants to request funding, using that funding to hire people, and then working on the kind of problems that that funding is for. That's a major process of the research, the major part of the research process as a professor. And that will require your research work to be restricted in some sense, right? You might still have some wiggle room to tailor that. So within that general domain, you might have some room to work on whatever aspect of it you like better, but with thoda bahut restricted hoega. And therefore, it is important to find an advisor who has a grant for the type of work that you want to do. ठीक है. अच्छा, दूसरा तरीका आपको आरशिप का है इंडस्ट्री स्पॉन्सरशिप का. So these big tech companies, they will often sponsor universities or collaborate with universities or professors and give some funding to those professors, again, to hire PhD students to do research in the kind of work that would benefit the tech company itself, right? So if you're working in petroleum engineering, BP might fund a university's petroleum engineering department in order to give them the resources to get PhD students to work on a new method of oil refinement or something, right? So उनका भी फायदा है कि उनको outsource करने का मौका मिल रहा है काम को. They don't have to directly hire people to do that. They can just fund. So if they hire somebody, if they hire a PhD qualified guy to do that kind of research, they're paying him much more than what they're paying that professor to give you, right, in order to do that research. So उस तरह के collaborative partnerships exist करती हैं. In that case, your work would be kind of tailored toward industry, toward applications, toward that firm जिसने वो grant या sponsorship दी है. And generally, the source of your funding will also somewhat not determine, but sort of nudge you in the direction of what it trains you to become. So if you work on projects which are funded by academic grants, research grants, then that project that you work on, the kind of work that you do, would be more suited to driving you towards an academic position in the future. And if you work on a project that has industry sponsorship, the training that you get from that project and the kind of work that you do on that project will train you better to get into academia after you graduate as well. It's not that you definitely आपका path set नहीं हो जाता है ऐसा कि आपको दूसरे पे जाने का मौका ना मिले, मगर आपकी training थोड़ी सी बेहतर जो है थोड़ी सी nudge हो जाती है उस direction में, depending on what the source of your funding is. So yeah. And then there's which you basically know about. TA-ship में भी अगर आप PhD के दौरान TA-ship कर रहे हैं तो आपको वही tuition waiver plus stipend plus health insurance उसके जरिए से मिल रही होती है. सही. So how does all of this work in a comprehensive way? Typically, when you get admitted to a PhD department, to an academic department as a PhD student, so there's two ways of getting admitted, right? So basically, when you apply, you note down in your SOP and in some places in your application on the website as well, okay, what professors you'd like to work with. अब आपको एक तरीका ये है कि उनमें से जिन जिन प्रोफेसर का आपने नाम लिखा है या कोई और प्रोफेसर आपकी एप्लीकेशन देखे, उसको पसंद आए, उसने रखना है बंदा, वो आपसे बात करे और कहे कि भाई मेरे से बात करो, और उस बात के बाद वो कहे कि भाई ठीक है मैंने आपको रखना है, तो फिर वो एडमिशंस कमेटी को कहेगा आई वांट टू admit this guy, I want to hire him and I will fund him. तो वो शुरू से you're funded by a particular professor if you accept that offer. The other way is that they will see and that your application is good enough for them to admit you without necessarily tying you to a professor in the beginning, right? That could be because none of the professors are interested right now, or that could be because they didn't bother to show those professors your resume and they decided you're good enough anyway, or whatever else. But you could be admitted to a department without being tied to a professor at the beginning. And in that case, the department will typically, for maybe a semester, maybe 2 semesters, एंड दे विल टेल यू कि भाई अभी तो आप फेलोशिप पे हो, डिपार्टमेंट की फेलोशिप जो है वो 1 सेमेस्टर के लिए या 2 सेमेस्टर के लिए है, और उस दौरान आपने एडवाइजर ढूंढना है जो कि आपको आगे आरशिप पे फंड करेगा फॉर द रेस्ट ऑफ योर पीएचडी. एंड दिस इज generally many cases are like this, that you don't have an advisor right at the beginning, you choose an advisor after you go. So इस तरह के स्टूडेंट को फिर जब वो जाएगा तो पहले सेमेस्टर में ही he'll have to start looking at the options available to him, and to find an advisor and to talk to them and to get them, convince them to fund him uh, during that first semester. Okay, yeah. On the last slide, the industry funded project will prepare you better for industry positions and vice versa for academic research funded projects. ठीक है. अच्छा, ये भी हो सकता है कि आपके एडवाइजर की फंडिंग सोर्स रन आउट हो जाए, बिकॉज ग्रांट्स जो है आमतौर पे कभी 2 साल के लिए होंगे, कभी 3 साल के लिए होंगे. हो सकता है वो 1 साल पहले उसने ग्रांट लिया था, 1 साल के लिए उस ग्रांट के जरिए से उसने एक पीएचडी स्टूडेंट फंड किया था. अब वो पीएचडी स्टूडेंट ग्रेजुएट हो गया, उस ग्रांट के अब 2 साल रह गए, उसने आपको हायर किया, आपने उसके साथ काम किया, आपने अच्छा काम नहीं किया, उस फंडिंग एजेंसी ने जब टाइम अप हुआ तो उन्होंने कहा कि वी आर नॉट गोइंग टू रिन्यू योर ग्रांट एंड देयरफॉर योर फंडिंग रन्स आउट. ठीक है, तो फिर आप क्या करोगे? You might have to do repeated TAships because that professor might not have other funding opportunities available in order to fund you. तो यूनिवर्सिटी ने जो आपको गारंटी दी थी कि हम आपको फंड करेंगे, वो इस तरह इस्तेमाल होगी कि वो कहेंगे कि ठीक है हमारे पास इतनी टीएशिप अपॉर्चुनिटीज अवेलेबल है, जिस जिस बच्चे के पास फंडिंग नहीं है उसको हम टीए बना देंगे, right? So then you have to do TAships, you might have to do repeated TAships. So there are some people जिनको किसी और तरीके से नई फंडिंग मिली तो उनको 4 5 6 सेमेस्टर लगातार उसी कोर्स की TAship करनी पड़ती है, which is very tedious because obviously it distracts from your research and takes away a lot of time. You might have to switch projects. Maybe आपके एडवाइजर का एक पर्टिकुलर प्रोजेक्ट की फंडिंग खत्म होगी मगर उसके पास किसी दूसरे प्रोजेक्ट की फंडिंग है, वो कहेगा उस पे काम करना छोड़ दो, अब इस पे काम करो. और you might have to change advisor, किसी और एडवाइजर के पास फंडिंग अवेलेबल है, वो कहता है कि तुम मेरे पास आ जाओ मैं तुम्हें फंड कर देता हूं. So you might have to do that, right? So in all of these cases it's less than ideal, right? If you don't ideally want to go through having your advisor run out of funds, and therefore it is important to, number one, choose an advisor that has a good amount of funding available and can guarantee that, or somewhat guarantee that they'll be able to fund you throughout the PhD. And number two, to work hard, because if you don't do well, then your funding might not get renewed. So if your advisor is active in research, then it's more likely then that he or she will have sufficient funds to support you throughout on an RA-ship. And how do you determine whether they're active? You go look up the papers they've published in good quality journals in recent years. If your advisor changes university, for example, उसका tenure की evaluation अभी आ रही है 2 साल बाद और उसको नहीं मिला तो उसको छोड़ना पड़ेगा, तो तुम्हें या तो advisor change करना पड़ेगा या उसको follow करना पड़ेगा. So look for people who either have tenure or who are doing so well that you're pretty sure that they'll get tenure. And how do you find out? You again look at their record. How good are they as a teacher? You can look at their ratings on, for example, ratemyprofessors.com, or you can look at how many publications they have. You can ask their PhD students कि भाई आपका advisor जो है वो अभी तो assistant professor है, that means उसको tenure नहीं मिला हुआ, तो how likely do you think it is that he'll get tenure? अगर मैं उसके पास आऊँ तो any chance कि वो उसको छोड़ना पड़ेगी यूनिवर्सिटी और मुझे कुछ और देखना पड़ेगा. तो इस तरह की चीजें जो है आप उनके PhD students से पूछ सकते हैं. And I'll talk in more detail about contacting professors and PhD students to get information. Can you guys still hear me? Because it's telling me that my connection is unstable.
We can hear you, sir.
Okay. Uh, Sorry, one second. Okay. I'll talk about contacting people in towards the end of the presentation. Acha. So this uncertainty in funding is a major source of stress. So you have to talk to your advisor about it openly. And in general, again, this is one thing that हमारा जो W15 का गोल्ड मेडलिस्ट था उसने मुझे वाज़े तौर पे कहा था कि बच्चों को बताना कि you should have an advisor. You should pick an advisor who you can talk to openly. So तकल्लुफ़ नहीं होना चाहिए, इतनी उनकी हैबत और एहतराम इतना नहीं होना चाहिए कि आप उनसे बात ना कर सको. You choose someone who's open and talks to you candidly about where you stand, what your progress is, what your situation is, what your funding looks like, and so on. So yeah, that's pretty much it about yeah, and continuation of funding and often will depend on your performance, right? So that's all about funding for now. Importance of advisor. I talked about this a little bit last time. I'll talk about it in a lot more detail now. How to choose an advisor. It's the most important element of your PhD. A couple of people, more than one actually, who I collaborated with to get this presentation going. Unke alfaz the your advisor is God. Nauzubillah. Obviously, you know that I don't like that, but that really shows you the kind of power that your advisor has over you. It's more than the influence that your boss would have over you in a corporate structure. And just because someone is a good researcher or a good teacher doesn't mean that they are a good advisor. That's a separate category of performance altogether. Like just because you're a good father doesn't mean you're a good son, and so on. And a bad advisor can make your life a living hell. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. And really, the reason I'm telling you this is because so that you don't get caught up in, oh yaar, ye university mein jana hai, chahe jaisa marzi advisor mil jaye, right? My roommate at MIT was a WE14 gold medalist from LUMS, and when he applied to MIT, there was only one professor who was willing to take him, and that guy's name is Steve. तो स्टीव जो है उसके बारे में उसने स्टीव के एक स्टूडेंट से पूछा कि स्टीव कैसा एडवाइजर है. उसने कहा स्टीव के पास ना आना, स्टीव अच्छा एडवाइजर नहीं है. अच्छा, स्टीव इज अ फेमस रिसर्चर, स्टीव पब्लिशेस वेरी वेल, स्टीव इज अ वेरी गुड टीचर, ही हैज सम ऑफ द हाईएस्ट रेटेड टीचिंग रिव्यूज in electrical engineering at MIT. But this one student of his said कि अच्छा एडवाइजर नहीं है इसके पास ना आना. मेरे रूममेट ने क्या किया कि उसको MIT का इतना भूत सवार था और मेरे ख्याल से उसका किसी बहुत अच्छी दूसरी जगह में हुआ नहीं था. आई थिंक he didn't get into any of the other top tier universities. He would have needed to drop down a tier if he want not go to MIT. So ये साइड यार देखी जाएगी, चले जाएंगे, क्या ज्यादा कर लेगा, थोड़ा मुश्किल होएगा, थोड़ा बदतमीज होएगा. उस बेचारे के साथ इतनी बुरी हुई है उसके मास्टर्स के दौरान. His advisor was verbally abusive, he was emotionally abusive, manipulative, he was क्या कहते हैं, he was not supportive, he did not give time, he did not give feedback, he did not give advice properly. He just sort of treated his students like monkeys who are there to publish papers for him. And he had such a hard time, that poor guy, that he developed a stress related eating disorder, and he lost double digit kilos of weight, and he developed black patches under his eyes. And जब वो घर गया बेचारा छुट्टी के लिए, तो उसकी अम्मी मतलब रोने लगी परेशान होकर, देखे कि मेरे बेटे को क्या हो गया. Right? That is what a bad advisor can do to you. And उसको और कोई मसला नहीं था, मेरे साथ रह रहा था, मेरे साथ रूममेट के तौर पे बड़ा खुश था. We had a good relationship, he had a good relationship with his family, he had no other problems in his life except that his advisor was a complete jerk. So don't go to a university just for their name if you don't get a good advisor. And if somebody's PhD student tells you negative things about their advisor, please listen to them. Okay, so how do you select an advisor? Number one, obviously, the first eliminator is whether their work is interesting to you. You check the web page for the kind of projects that they work on. You skim through their recent papers. अच्छा, this is something that PhD students often neglect कि आप देखते ही नहीं हो कि उनके papers जो हैं वो किस तरह के हैं. सही है, हो सकता है वो आपके type of area काम करते हो, मगर वो इतना theoretical काम करते हो, इतना गाढ़ा और इतना proof based हो कि आपको बिल्कुल पसंद आए. या हो सकता है वो इतना flimsy किस्म का काम करते हो कि आपको लगे कि यार ये तो सारा data based है, data के based on data है, इसमें theory का है. तो look at their papers, look at the kind of stuff that they do. At least look at the abstracts, right? And see whether the makes you think, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to see what the answer to that is, right? Listen to the kind of lectures and talks that they give. Professors are always traveling around and giving different seminars and workshops and lectures and so on. So listen to what they talk about. Are they well respected in their field? You can again check their publications and citation and H index and so on. You can ask people in the research area. This is the most important part. What are they like to work with? What kind of person do you want to work with? Do you want somebody who is pleasant to work with, who is supportive in difficulties, who is invested and interested in their students' development rather than their own career development only, and somebody who has reasonable expectations? इस तरह की सारी चीजें जो है ना आपने directly उनके PhD students से पूछनी होती हैं. You ask their current and former graduate students. And you read reviews about their personality on Rate My Professor. So ये सारी hyper चीजें websites हैं, उनकी मैंने hyperlinks दी हुई हैं. So you have a look at these websites. So for example, you go look at XYZ professor at XYZ university, and you see those reviews specifically which talk about their personality, because Rate My Professors it's primarily for rating them as teachers in certain courses, right? हो सकता है मैं एक कोर्स अच्छा पढ़ाऊं क्योंकि मुझे अच्छा आता है और दूसरा कोर्स मैं इतना अच्छा ना पढ़ाऊं. You ignore that part. You focus on those reviews which talk about कि तमीज़दार है, बदतमीज़ है, helpful है, unhelpful है, and students में interested है या नहीं है, and so on, right? Okay, does their style of advising match your preference, right? So some people are very hands-on कि वो आपके nitty-gritty में जाके आपके साथ देखेंगे, खास तौर पे शुरू में. Some people are hands-off, वो कहेंगे करके जो भी progress हुई मुझे दिखा देना. Some people will have a schedule, महीने पहले से वो आपको कहेंगे कि भाई फलाने डेट पे फलाने टाइम पे आपकी मेरी मीटिंग है. Some people will be flexible and they'll just walk into the lab and say कि अच्छा तुम क्या कर रहे हो, तुम क्या कर रहे हो, ये बताओ, अच्छा चलो आज तुमसे मिल लेता हूँ, and so on. Some will be casual, they'll have a friendly kind of relationship with their students. Some will be formal. So you ask, you either ask them about their advising style, or you ask, or I think you should do both. You should ask their graduate students as well about their advising style, and whether you're comfortable with whatever that happens to be. Okay. How big is their lab? That's an interesting question, because if they have a lot of students, you might get less time and less of their support and direct guidance, but you'll have more people to collaborate with, right? So if they have like 8 or 9 other PhD students, you can work on projects together. You'll have other people who are interested in working on the same thing as you do, but each of those 9 people are then competing for the same same amount of time that advisor has. If you have fewer students, each of you might get more time. But if they have very few students, then that's a potential red flag. Why do they have such few students? Is it because they don't have enough funding? That means they're not very active. Is it because students don't like to be advised by them? That's a big red flag. Is it because they're close to retirement and not necessarily wanting to get new students? So आपको पता करना पड़ेगा उनके current performer students से कि अगर इनके बहुत थोड़े students हैं. If they have a lot of senior PhD students or postdocs, you can potentially find secondary mentors. And in fact, some famous professors जिनकी मतलब रेपुटेशन बहुत अच्छी होती है और उनको बहुत फंडिंग मिल रही होती है, वो फिर बहुत सारे पोस्टडॉक्स हायर कर लेते हैं और अपने PhD स्टूडेंट्स को में कर देते हैं. So basically they will your direct advisor or your direct supervisor will be a postdoc or a senior PhD student or some other researcher who's working in the same lab as this big shot, hotshot professor. And that is the person who you'll be learning from directly and who you'll be interacting with closely. And that the guy who's responsible for your funding, your advisor, overseeing figure who generally guides you कि अच्छा ये काम कर लो, वो काम कर लो, rather than actually advising you in a close knit sense. For some people that might work because एक postdoc को एक दो से ज़्यादा स्टूडेंट्स उनके सुपरविजन में नहीं आएंगे, which means you get a good amount of time with that postdoc. मगर postdoc is not a full professor. He is a very recent PhD graduate, might not be as experienced in advising and so on. But it might work for you, it might not work for you. That will also then heavily depend on the mizaj of the postdoc and you know how they like to work and whether they're nice to work with. So if you end up applying to a hotshot professor who has a very big lab, then this is one question that you have to ask them. Do you advise your students directly, or is there a hierarchy where new students are more closely interacting with your postdocs and less closely with you? And I'm not saying कि अगर इस तरह का हो तो उधर ना जाओ, but just you know उसके बारे में सोचो और फिर उस potential postdoc से भी बात करो और उसके बारे में भी जानने की कोशिश करो and so on. What stage of their career are they in? So if it's a new professor, he will be less experienced in advising, but might be more excited. You know, नया बंदा नया काम करने आता है, जाहिर बात है उसकी थोड़ी excitement ज़्यादा होती है, मगर हो सकता है उसकी funding थोड़ी कम हो. टिपिकली यूनिवर्सिटीज जो हैं जब नया प्रोफेसर हायर करती हैं असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर टेन्योर ट्रैक पे, तो उसको कुछ ना कुछ वो देते हैं फंडिंग विच इज कॉल्ड स्टार्टअप फंडिंग, विच मीन्स कि जब तक आप ग्रांट लिखोगे और आपको 6 महीने साल बाद फंडिंग मिलेगी, उतनी देर तक आपने, जारी बात है, दे वांट देम टू हायर स्टार्ट हायरिंग पीएचडी स्टूडेंट्स इमीडिएटली, सो दे विल the university will give some funding to the professor in order to use that to hire PhD students. But थोड़ी देर के लिए ही होएगी और हो सकता है आगे वो जब ग्रांट्स लिखे तो उसको ना मिले एंड सो ऑन, तो उसमें थोड़ा सा एक कैविएट होता है. बट न्यू प्रोफेसर का फायदा बहुत हो सकता है कि वो very directly he or she would have been working on the cutting edge of research, right? So अगर एक प्रोफेसर है, आपको ये भी समझना है ना कि आप जब पीएचडी कर रहे हो तो आप जितना जानते हो अपनी रिसर्च के बारे में उतना आपका प्रोफेसर भी नहीं जानता होगा, right? So you would know the nitty-gritty of that cutting edge research more than your professor does. And therefore, when you graduate and become a new professor, you know more about the current trends in the field, and you can advise about them maybe slightly better than somebody who's much older can. So there are pros and cons to, you know, all of these different stages of careers. I'm just, you know, putting them out for you to think about. अगर प्रोफेसर इज क्लोज टू टेन्योर, टेन्योर के करीब प्रोफेसर्स पे डिमांड्स बढ़ जाते हैं, बिकॉज यू नो दैट देयर इवैल्यूएशन पीरियड इज कमिंग अप, उनका एग्जाम आ रहा है, तो फिर जाहिर बात है फिर दैट डिमांड सॉर्ट ऑफ फिल्टर्स डाउन टू यू एज वेल एज देयर स्टूडेंट्स. दे विल बी डिमांडिंग कि भाई काम करो काम करो काम करो. एंड फंडिंग और कंटिन्यूटी की अनसर्टेनिटी हो सकती है अगर उनका टेन्योर अप्रूव होने में कोई शक है, या तो हो ना कि कोई बहुत अच्छा फैकल्टी मेंबर हो. मिसाल के तौर पे मैं आपको बताता हूँ, अभी डॉक्टर फरीद गॉट टेन्योर I think last year या 2 साल पहले, मगर anybody could have seen that he is definitely going to get tenure, right? So LUMS would be stupid to not give him tenure. So उस तरह का बंदा अगर है तो then maybe you don't need to worry about continuity issues कि भाई उसको जाना तो नहीं पड़ेगा, उसकी फंडिंग तो नहीं कैंसिल हो जाएगी ये वो. But if it's somebody who you're not very sure about कि tenure मिलेगा कि नहीं मिलेगा, so then you have to think about whether you want to go to professor जिसका 1 या 2 या 3 साल में tenure application जो है वो due है. Tenure के बाद professors can be more laid back, which is part of what, you know, one of you talked about के isn't it bad for the quality of education? It's natural कि आपका जब एग्जाम हो गया है तो आप थोड़ा सा रिलैक्स हो जाते हो. It can be good as well कि वो उतना डिमांड नहीं करेगा आपसे, but it can be bad as well कि वो उतना पुश नहीं करेगा आपको और आपको अपने पे छोड़ देगा, और फिर अगर आप सुस्त हो तो फिर आप काम नहीं करोगे और फिर आपको ज़्यादा देर लगेगी पीएचडी करने और आप अच्छी पीएचडी नहीं करोगे. Right, so ये सारी चीजें हैं, but they might have more funding available because by that time they've sort of proved themselves. If they have tenure, that means that they've proved themselves and they should be able to get more grants approved. If they're a very old professor, they would be very experienced. हो सकता है कि उनकी मतलब इतने स्टूडेंट्स को उन्होंने एडवाइस किया कि उनको exactly पता है कि किस तरह स्टूडेंट को जो है वो लेके चलना है, स्टार्ट से फिनिश तक उसको इंडिपेंडेंट रिसर्चर बनाना है. मगर हो सकता है, ये भी हो सकता है ऑन दी अदर हैंड कि वो थक गए हों, बुढ़े हो गए हों, उनको शौक ना इतना रहा हो एंड सो ऑन, राइट? या वो पुरानी चीज़ों पे अभी तक काम करना चाहते हो या जो भी है. So look at people who are working on, you know, all of these 4 things, they have pros and cons. Look at people who are working on cutting edge things. Look at people whose funding is guaranteed. Look at people who are excited about advising and so on. Also, if they have some other roles, so for example, if they are, you know, also working on a startup साथ साथ, or they are department chair, or they are, you know, provost or whatever else, they might not have so much time for their doctoral students. So research पे उतने उस 3 साल के लिए, जिस 3 साल के लिए वो किसी और ओहदे पे हैं, बड़े ओहदे पे, उस 3 साल के लिए हो सकता है उनके पास को बहुत ज़्यादा टाइम ना हो अपने स्टूडेंट्स को देने. Another important thing, ग्रेजुएशन क्राइटेरिया. कुछ प्रोफेसर जो है ना वो लीचड हो जाते हैं. वो फिर इस तरह करते हैं कि बिकॉज यू नो इन द फर्स्ट कपल ऑफ ईयर्स दे ट्रेनिंग यू, you are not really producing anything really. Output आपका इतना होता नहीं क्योंकि आपके पास अभी वो tools ही नहीं है जिससे जरिए से आप quality research करो. तो पहले वो they will invest time and money in you as somebody who's not giving any output, and then later on you will start giving output and you'll start publishing papers and you'll become somebody who's valuable to them. A senior PhD student is very valuable to a professor. Some professors are selfish and they will make that senior PhD student work for more time than they should, right? Because they choose essentially when you graduate or not. They will tell you, okay, now you've done enough, go write your thesis and then get out of here. But some will keep saying कि नहीं थोड़ा और की जरूरत है, अभी तुम्हारा काफी नहीं हुआ, नहीं अभी थोड़ा और काम करो, because they want more papers out of you, right? So उस तरह के selfish nature कुछ में होती है. तो ये आपको देखना पड़ेगा कि आमतौर पे उनके स्टूडेंट्स कितनी देर में ग्रेजुएट होते हैं. अगर एवरेज ग्रेजुएशन टाइम उस यूनिवर्सिटी का 4 साल है और इस प्रोफेसर के स्टूडेंट 6 साल बाद ग्रेजुएट होते हैं ऑन एवरेज, देन दैट्स एन इशू. If you're okay with that, so sure, go ahead, but and try to find out about that. Okay, so that's all about selecting an advisor. Last thing that we have on our agenda is reaching out to professors or students. Give me 1 second. Take a second. Yeah, I just wanted to have a look at the questions. TA-ship depends on TOEFL score as well. Yes, to some extent, you're going to need a decent TOEFL score in order to get a TA-ship. But typically, if they admit you, then that's an indication that your TOEFL score is good enough for them to let you do a TA-ship generally. Or they might say, take some academic English classes before we give you a TA-ship. How do you decide if a PhD student's opinion of an advisor is not biased? Depends what you mean by biased. Everybody's opinion of their advisor is going to be based on their experience personally with that advisor, right? So, for example, मेरा experience फरीद के साथ कैसा था, उसकी basis पे मैं सर फरीद के बारे में आपको बताऊंगा कि कैसे advisor हैं, right? हो सकता है your experience might be different. Maybe he was mean to you and he wasn't mean to me, or maybe he was mean to me and he wasn't mean to you. So obviously everybody will have their own perspective. That is why it is important to ask multiple PhD students, and that I'm going to talk about next. Okay, reaching out to professors. There's multiple times when you reach out to people, and multiple reasons to reach out to them, and multiple things that you ask them about, and I'll talk about all of that in a bit of detail. So if we get TOEFL waived and then give them later after admission, would that? Yeah. So generally, if they admit you as a PhD student, I wouldn't be too worried about being able to get a TA-ship later on. Yeah. Because typically you won't be doing a PhD immediately. You'll do a PhD. एक तो आपको आमतौर पे प्रोग्राम्स की रिक्वायरमेंट होगी कि भाई हर पीएचडी स्टूडेंट ने एक टीएशिप करनी है, ठीक है? तो आमतौर पे वो आप बाद में करोगे टुवर्ड्स योर लेटर इयर्स. बट अगर आपको करनी पड़ जाए फंडिंग की खातिर, तो दैट्स नॉट गोइंग टू बी इमीडिएटली. Hopefully it's not going to be immediately. So by that time, you'll have shown enough of your English speaking and writing abilities for them to be able to give you a TA-ship even without a TOEFL or whatever. Okay, so there are 3 times that you reach out to people: before applying, after applying, and after getting offers, right? So before applying, I would suggest, this is based on my suggestion, हर वो बंदा जिसके पास आप अप्लाई कर रहे हो उसके एक पीएचडी स्टूडेंट को ईमेल करो. तो अगर मैं 4 फर्क प्रोफेसर्स के पास अप्लाई कर रहा हूँ, उन चारों के एक पीएचडी स्टूडेंट को ढूंढ के और उसको मैं ईमेल करूंगा और मैं पूछूंगा कि भाई तुम्हारा एडवाइजर नए स्टूडेंट्स ले रहा है कि नहीं. वो कहेगा मुझे नहीं पता. आप कहोगे प्लीज उससे पूछ के बता दो, तो पूछ के बता देगा, ठीक है? या हो सकता है उसके पास डायरेक्ट आंसर हो, आमतौर पे नहीं होएगा, मगर यू कैन गेट सम आइडिया। मे बी ही नोज कि भाई इसके पास 2 स्टूडेंट्स हैं जो कि अगले साल ग्रेजुएट होने वाले हैं, एंड बेस्ड ऑन दैट ही कैन गिव यू एन आइडिया कि यस आई थिंक ही विल बी एक्सेप्टिंग न्यू पीपल बिकॉज सम ऑफ हिज स्टूडेंट्स आर ग्रेजुएटिंग, या जो भी है, कुछ ना कुछ आपको आइडिया मिल जाएगा। दूसरा ये कि आप अपने क्रेडेंशियल्स उसको पेश करो और बताओ कि भाई ये मेरा ये मेरे क्रेडेंशियल्स हैं, डू यू थिंक दैट योर प्रोफेसर वुड बी हैप्पी टू वर्क विद मी। और तीसरा उनसे पूछो कि भाई आपका प्रोफेसर कैसा है, राइट, टू वर्क विद। And so actually before instead of showing you all of this, let me first show you the sample, right? So yeah, here is a sample of this first type of email. This is an email I sent to a PhD student working in NYU Abu Dhabi with a certain professor, and I asked her about her experience with that professor. I asked her, do you know whether he'll be considering PhD applicants? Could you give some feedback about him as an advisor? And could you suggest NYU Abu Dhabi that I should look at, right? So इस तरह की सारी चीजें I provided my LinkedIn, I asked her if she would want me to provide my CV and so on. ठीक है, I gave a little bit of background of who I am. So that's an example email of the first type before applying. Ignore that second point. Let's look at that third point. Third point should have been before the second point. But do not spam professors with emails before applying. कि सर ये मैं फलाना बंदा हूँ, यही email जो मैंने PhD student को की है, ये मैं directly advisor को भी कर सकता था. But don't do that because they get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those emails, and they will most likely ignore you. It will probably even count against you for spamming them, unless you have a specific reason to talk to tell them about something. For example, if you've collaborated with them previously, or if you've written a paper which was based on their work and you have a very good idea of their work and a specific idea of a particular thing you want to work on with them, uh, or you've published a paper in the kind of stuff that they are working on. So basically, if you have some way of um, putting yourself apart from the crowd of all of the other people who are going to be emailing them, then you should email them. Otherwise, you should not, because uska koi fayda nahi. सो जनरली एक आधा या दो या तीन, ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा 2-3 प्रोफेसर ऐसे होंगे जिनको आप अपने एप्लीकेशन से पहले, यानी कि आजकल के दिनों में नवंबर में ईमेल करोगे, और वो होंगे जो कि आपके फर्स्ट चॉइस होंगे इन टर्म्स ऑफ हु यू वांट टू वर्क विद, और यू हैव अ एंड यू हैव अ पर्टिकुलर रीजन to email them. Otherwise, don't email them before applying. Email them instead after applying, right? So after you've applied, you've submitted your application, then you send an email to those professors who you identified as potential advisors, and you show an interest, and you ask for a meeting to discuss your application. Because if you reach out to them, number one, that's demonstrating an interest in them specifically, more than just the application. Because application में तो आप बहुत सारे लोग जो हैं बहुत सारे प्रोफेसर के नाम लिख देते हैं. मैंने अगर 6 जगह अप्लाई किया, उन 6 जगहों में 3-3 प्रोफेसर के नाम लिखे हैं, 18 प्रोफेसर के नाम लिखे हैं मैंने. अगर मैं उन 18 में से 5-6 को ईमेल करता हूँ स्पेसिफिकली और कहती इंटरेस्टेड, और अगर आप मुझे रखेंगे तो आई वुड वेरी सीरियसली कंसिडर दैट ऑफर, एंड कैन वी डिस्कस माय एप्लीकेशन. So that will register your interest on a higher level. And also, since you have already applied, you are no longer amongst the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who are emailing them. You are somebody who has a particular reason to email them, which is that they have your application on the table to evaluate already. And here is an example of that second type of oh no, sorry. So here is an example of that second type of email. Okay, so this is a lady that I applied to in Georgia Tech, and I asked, okay, I've already applied, and I'm interested in your work and working under you, and my research interests overlap karte hain, or I hope that you've seen my application. And note this, I didn't contact you earlier since I anticipated you would have been flooded by email from potential applicants. And if you're hiring, and if you're open to considering, can we have a short discussion about my application? And based on that, you have a Skype talk or something. They will ask you, "Acha kis kaam karna hai, kya background hai," whatever. You talk to them, you get an idea of what they are like, and they get an idea of what you are like, and maybe that can lead to them giving you an offer. Okay. And here is her reply. Your scores are excellent, but due to the overall lab size I'm trying to maintain, I only bring on one PhD student per year, and I have a former undergrad researcher who has applied as well. Basically, this is a polite way of saying, okay, I don't accept you as my student, and I'm not going to give you an offer. And then she said, there's somebody else at the university, and I'll talk to him, and maybe he can keep you instead, right? So that's a typical interaction with a professor for after you've applied. अच्छा, ये तीसरा केस, exceptional case की हमने बात की ना, कि you can talk to potential advisors before applying as well in exceptional cases. So here is my exceptional case. This is probably the only guy who I emailed before I had already applied to him, and that was because मैंने अपने मास्टर्स के थीसिस में जो पेपर लिखा था, वो मैंने जब सबमिट किया था, तो उस जर्नल का एडिटर जो था, उस रिव्यू प्रोसेस का जो लीड था, वो ये बंदा था, और इस पेपर को जो मैंने लिखा था वो उसी के काम पे बेस्ड था जो काम उसने 90s और 80s में किया था, राइट? सो देन आई told him कि this is what I'm interested in working in, और ये मैंने पढ़ा, और आपका काम probably I think मेरे से ज़्यादा उसका काम किसी और ने नहीं पढ़ा होगा, because उसका काम एक तो 20 साल पुराना था, और एक पर्टिकुलर प्रॉब्लम थी जो 20 साल से किसी ने सॉल्व नहीं की थी, वो मैंने सॉल्व की. तो I was in a good position to email him and talk to him about right. And note this as well, कि before talking to him I had talked to another student there, PhD student, and asked कि भाई advisor के तौर पे ये बंदा कैसा है, right? And I'm asking him, whether he'll be considering new students or not, and so on. And here is his reply. So he talks about के क्या कहते हैं, ये सारा application process है, and he talks about the funding, and he talks about क्या कहते हैं, the mechanics of the PhD process. And then he says this, right? So this is again uski that's nice of him कि उसने बड़ा openly मुझे बताया कि भाई हमारा department बहुत small है, और सिर्फ 3 प्रोफेसर्स हैं जो कि रिसर्च करते हैं, उनमें से एक अगले साल रिटायर हो जाएगा. Obtaining new funding is uncertain. We might be unable to admit new students even if their credentials are excellent. Despite the uncertainty, I hope you will apply, right? So again, that's also just a polite way of saying कर लो अप्लाई, अगर हो सका तो मैं तुम्हें रख लूंगा, मगर जनरली व्हाट ही सेइंग इज कि आई एम सॉरी, मैं आपको मोस्ट लाइकली नहीं रख पाऊंगा, ठीक है? Okay, so then so that's before applying, and then talking to certain professors before applying, talking to other professors, PhD students before applying, and then talking to professors after applying. Once you get offers, you have to correspond with those people who have given you offers, those potential advisors. या तो अगर आपको किसी यूनिवर्सिटी से ऑफर आया without any particular advisor, so then you talk to professors at that university saying, I've got an admission to this university and you are one of the people I want to work with, so let's talk, right? Or if the advisor has admitted you directly, then you talk to them obviously about whether or not you should accept their offer, and you talk about what kind of directions they have in mind for you to work on, what kind of funding they have available, किस किस्म के projects हैं उनके, how they plan to fund you, and their advising style, and so on. वही सारी चीजें जो हमने पिछली स्लाइड्स में डिस्कस की थी. After you've received offers, you also talk to multiple current and former PhD students of each potential advisor, right? And this is the point where you want to know in a lot of detail about what it is like to work under that advisor. So you ask them about that, you ask specific questions, and I'll show you a sample later on, and you ask them anything that that you should know about the program or department that other people might not know at first glance, because कभी कभी कुछ प्रोग्राम की ना कुछ peculiarities होती हैं जो कि आमतौर पे लोगों को नहीं पता होती. once you go there and you are a PhD student there, तो आपको पता चलती हैं. तो उस तरह की चीज़ों के बारे में भी आप उनसे पूछोगे, is there anything specific that you think that I should know before I decide whether or not to accept this offer? And then their advice, whether they think that you should accept the offer or not, right? So that's also important. How to connect with PhD students working under an advisor. You go to the advisor's website and they will have a list of PhD students who are working with them. Or you go to LinkedIn and you look at people who are, you have to do some snooping around. Or you can look at the publications from that advisor on Google Scholar and see who are the first authors on those publications. And then Google their names and then see, maybe they'll have a, आमतौर पे PhD students का अपना भी वेब पेज होता है यूनिवर्सिटी की वेबसाइट पे, so उस तरह आप देख सकते हो कि उनका एडवाइजर कौन है, and so on. तो स्नूपिंग करनी पड़ती है, मेहनत करनी पड़ती है, वक्त लगाना पड़ता है इन चीज़ों में, but this is something you're going to be doing for the next 7 years of your life, therefore you might as well put some effort into making the right decision. A lot of people might get lucky and not do any of this diligence and still end up with a good advisor. but you don't want to take that risk. You want to minimize the risk of ending up with somebody who you're not going to like working with, and therefore this diligence is required, right? If this seems like a lot of effort, uh, consider not doing a PhD, because this is just the start of the kind of effort that's going to be required during your PhD. So uh, you know uh, somebody who जो कि ये एफर्ट देख के परेशान हो रहा है, उसको उसको फिर पीएचडी के बारे में दोबारा सोचना चाहिए, बिकॉज इस तरह की चीजें आपको, इस तरह की डिलीजेंस जो है वो बहुत सी चीजों में करनी पड़ेगी. यू हैव टू, मिसाल के तौर पे अगर आप लिटरेचर रिव्यू कर रहे हैं तो आपको 15-20-30 उससे भी ज्यादा 50 पेपर पढ़ने पड़ेंगे in order to see what is the state of the art, what are the different things that people have explored, what are the maybe somebody's worked on a completely separate problem, अगर उसका एक कोई एस्पेक्ट है जो कि आपके रिसर्च में पोटेंशियली हेल्पफुल हो सकता है, you need to find out those things, right? So इस तरह की चीजें जो है वो पीएचडी का हिस्सा है. अच्छा, and the following slides have samples. So corresponding with advisors after receiving offers, corresponding with students after receiving offers. Let's look at examples of that. So here is my email to an advisor, to a professor at Georgia Tech, and he's a very big shot professor. And that's why I asked him specifically कि भाई grad students को आप postdoc को assign करते हो या do you directly supervise everybody? Are you hands on or hands off? What is the structure? How often do you meet students and so on? So this is a very senior professor, very big name in transportation. So he told me a lot of detail. I'm not gonna read all of this out, but he talks about okay, all of my students are supervised directly by me, and I have multidisciplinary work and so on and blah blah. ये पढ़ लेना बाद में अगर दिल चाहे तो. And I asked him about funding. Is funding tied to a particular grant that will require a certain agenda to be followed during my work? If so, could you please share some details about the kind of deliverables you would expect and the length of the guaranteed funding, right? तो अगेन वो बड़े वाजे तौर पे मुझे बता रहा है कि 3 साल की गारंटी है, उसके बाद गारंटी नहीं है. दैट मींस दैट विल बी बेस्ड ऑन माय परफॉर्मेंस, राइट? सो इफ आई परफॉर्म वेल, then he will use his grants to fund me in further as well. If I don't, then he might not do that. उसके grants अगर renew ना हुए जिन पे मैं काम कर रहा हूँ तो मुझे शायद पे करनी पड़े या जो भी. Acha, and here are the startup funds that he was talking about. He's a very senior professor, so he joined Georgia Tech as a full professor, I think. But since he's joined a new place and he'll have to start applying for new funding, so utni der ke liye unhone usko startup funds diye. That will change as I have future projects, right? So those startup funds are temporary, they are short term. And I've been fortunate to completely fund all of my PhD students. ये बड़ा ज़बरदस्त प्रोफेसर है, क्वालिटी इसके काम की अच्छी है, तो जाहिर बात है इसको ग्रांट्स मिलते रहेंगे और फिर इसको फंडिंग मिलती रहेगी और ये अपने स्टूडेंट्स को फंड करने का इसको मसला नहीं होएगा, राइट? एंड देन ही टॉक्स अबाउट कि हाउ डिस्पाइट द फैक्ट दैट फंडिंग जो है वो कुछ ना कुछ रिस्ट्रिक्टिव होती है, मैं फिर भी अपने स्टूडेंट्स की डिसर्टेशन टॉपिक जो है वो ओपन रखने की कोशिश करता हूँ, राइट? सो दीज आर ऑल दिस इज अ गुड आंसर. आई थिंक आई वुड हैव बीन हैप्पी टू एक्सेप्ट हिज ऑफर if I didn't have other considerations. Okay, and here is a sample email to one of this. Actually, ये email मैंने copy paste करके इसी professor की मेरे ख्याल 5 या 6 students को भेजी थी, right? That's what I said. If you're seriously considering accepting somebody's offer, talk to a lot of their current and former students before deciding, because of the exact thing that Anusha said, you might get a biased opinion. So you want a holistic opinion from everybody. And note the specific questions that I've asked. Is she helpful, supportive, understanding, accommodating, especially in the difficult times? I know that she's very busy. So how closely does she work with students? How often do you meet her? How much of an input does she have in the details of a problem? What is her style of research? How does she approach these problems? Are her expectations reasonable? Is she more demanding? Is she pleasant to work with as a person? Is she technically solid in her area? Is she highly regarded in the community? Is her work high quality? Right? So these are very specific questions that I asked. You might ask similar questions. You might ask different questions depending on what matters to you. But generally, this is what I asked to all of her students, and this is the kind of reply that I got. She's also extremely supportive. She cares. She gives you the liberty to work on what you want. And again, look at this. There are many PhD students being put on projects that they don't care about or not interested in, right? And then he talks about open door policy has. She'll make time for a discussion and blah, blah, blah. She is demanding, right? He clearly says she is demanding. And lots of other things, right? So he says, I'm lucky to have her as my advisor. I think she's extremely nice, blah blah blah, and I would definitely choose her again.
I guess circa internet. Can you guys hear sir? Or is he stuck for everyone? Okay, I guess we'll just wait until he comes back. If you guys have any questions, तो आप लोग chat में लिख दो. I think we can also like when sir comes back, you can also unmute and raise your hand and talk to him.
Sorry about that. My battery died. I should have seen that coming, but I was too in doing what I was doing. Okay, my voice is back.
Yes, sir.
You guys can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so basically इसी तरह के मुझे replies आए बाकी उसके students से भी generally मुझे सबसे positive feedback मिला, and that is why I ended up choosing this professor. This is my advisor currently. That's who I'm working with. Uh, and that's pretty much it. That's the end of what I have to say. Here is the summary. You have to evaluate whether doing a PhD fits into your desired career path. Do it for the right reasons. Don't do it just because people are doing it. Don't do it just because you have nothing better to do. Don't do it just because you don't want to work in the industry. Do it for the particular reasons that one actually does a PhD for. Um, and another important thing, again, this is something that a lot of other people who I talked to about this presentation, they told me to tell you guys, consider getting a taste of research before deciding whether to do a PhD, right? Either do a master's with thesis, or thesis के दौरान आपको research करनी पड़ेगी, या फिर आर्यशिप करो किसी के साथ after graduating. एक साल आर्यशिप करना लम्स में ही is not a bad option. You might not get a lot of money, but you will definitely get an experience of what आर्यशिप is like. Your senior project does not give you the anywhere near the full experience that you need to determine what research is actually like. Another option that you might have is look at places in the Middle East, because they are always looking for researchers, research associates, research assistants, and आमतौर पे तो they want people with masters already, but they can also hire people with just bachelors, and you get good money for that, and उस एक दो साल में you can save up a good amount of money that will help you later on during your PhD as well, because you're not going to get paid much during your PhD. And that will give you a good idea of determining whether you like research or not. Okay, so don't jump into a PhD without knowing what you're in for, right? That's the summary of that point. And strongly consider the opportunity costs, right? There are heavy opportunity costs. Number one is financial. Without exaggeration, if you choose to do a PhD, you will, for the next 6 years, be earning only about 20% of what people who would do a master's and go into industry would earn, right? So मिसाल के तौर पे अगर आप मास्टर्स करते हो और उसके बाद फिर आपकी अमेजोन में जॉब लग जाती है, तो मास्टर्स पे आपका कितना खर्चा हुआ? तकरीबन आपका ₹1 करोड़ शायद खर्चा हो गया, ठीक है, 2 साल में. उसके बाद आप अमेजोन में गए और उन 2 साल के अंदर अंदर यू अर्न दैट बैक. यू मतलब वो ₹1 करोड़ आपने कमा लिए अमेजोन में काम करते हुए, एंड फिर फ्रॉम नाउ यू आर अर्निंग in the millions, millions of rupees, not dollars. But क्या कहते हैं, you're earning much more, much quicker, right? So if I look at somebody who, अगर मैंने 2 साल लम्स में ना किए होते तो मैं अभी तक आई वुड बी क्लोज टू द एंड ऑफ माय पीएचडी. तो अगर 2021 में मैं ग्रेजुएट करता तो अब तक मैं जितना कमा रहा था एज अ पीएचडी स्टूडेंट 6 साल से, मेरी सेविंग्स वुड बी मे बी 1/10 और लेस ऑफ somebody who did a master's, spent money, self-funded masters, then went to Amazon or Google or Facebook and worked, and then आज वो जिधर है और आगे वो जितना कमाएगा, that's a lot more than I would be getting at the moment, right? So consider very strongly the financial costs if you're in a position where you need to support your family, um, or you're in a position where, for whatever else, whatever other reason you need strong finances, then don't get into a PhD. um, and time, it'll take 5 to 7 years. You'll be at least 30 before you have your first job. I would suggest, and again, this is a very personal suggestion. I would suggest if you want to do a PhD, get married in the next couple of years. PhD के पहले 1-2 साल में ना शादी कर लो, because it can get very lonely. You need companionship. You need क्या कहते हैं, support, that helps you stay grounded and gives you support on the non-academic side. Because otherwise then you're touching 30 plus before you get married, and that's, in my opinion, that's way too late. But again, that's a very personal suggestion. And also amount of effort and rigor, right? So I'm not saying कि बाकी नौकरियों में आपको बहुत ज़्यादा काम नहीं करना पड़ता, शायद बहुत काम करना पड़े, मगर आपके काम का एक स्केड्यूल होता है. आमतौर पे आप 9 to 5 काम कर रहे हो, 5 बजे आप घर आ गए, बस आपने छोड़ दिया. आपने अब सुबह 9 बजे तक दोबारा अपने काम की फिक्र नहीं करनी आमतौर पे, right? And generally, when you're at work, there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of things that you do on autopilot. In a PhD, your tool is your brain. You're always working on something that's intellectually demanding, and that can lead to intellectual exhaustion, right? There's a difference between, अब मिसाल के तौर पे अभी recommendation का time आ रहा है, कुछ students हैं जिनकी recommendation मैंने सुनी है. अब वो recommendation लिख के submit करना, that's a mundane task, क्योंकि मैंने इतनी दफा लिखी हुई है, मैंने लिख के recommendation और उसको एक जगह submit करना है, फिर क्या कहते हैं, थोड़ा सा change करके दूसरी तरफ submit करना. Those are things I can do without really taxing my brain. But most of the work that I'll be doing during my PhD, that requires active concentration, and therefore that can lead to intellect sort of fatigue. And be very careful and thorough when you're selecting which offer to accept. So those are that's the general summary of what I have to say. Some resources. Do you need a PhD? This is Nick Feimster, का आप लोगों को पता होगा, very famous professor, and this was recommended to me by Waji. Some of you might know him. UIUC में उसने 2015 का CS बैच का वाहिद बंदा है शायद मेरे ख्याल से, जो कि अभी तक PhD कर रहा है, जिसने छोड़ी नहीं है. So that's a good resource. This is the resource that I shared last time as well. Then there's CS Rankings website, which has a bunch of good advice for PhD students. And this is more for somebody who's already started a PhD, but the kind of advice that you see here, that will give you an idea of what it's like to do a PhD as well. And as always, you can reach out to me and talk to me about any of this stuff in more detail. Okay, so somebody asked, you talked about that LUMS is not well recognized in the field of ML in US universities. It's a good option to choose some other CS field and then somehow change my field or include major part of ML in my thesis. That's a good question. That's a very good question. Baki bhi, whoever has questions, write them down now, because we'll keep going as long as there are questions, and then we'll stop. So I would suggest no. I wouldn't suggest that you choose some other CS field to get an admission in PhD and then somehow change your field, because that's a convoluted way of going about it. You could find something that bridges both ML and whatever other field you have some experience in your application. You could talk about, and you could definitely, ये भी हमने पिछली दफा बात की थी instructors वाले session में, कि you can use your credentials in one area to show that you are capable, and that ability ask for trust to be placed in you in a new area, right? And that is something that people will definitely look at. So if you have a good track record, if you have a good demonstration of ability, then people will accept that more broadly than just in that particular area. Because when they're admitting a PhD student, they don't expect that they're admitting somebody who's immediately going to be an expert in the field. They're admitting somebody who has the demonstrated potential to develop into an independent researcher, and therefore in that process you don't have to really worry so much about कि LUMS का ML में को बहुत ज़्यादा नाम नहीं है and so on. Yeah. Is it advisable to reach out to 40 to 50 professors? Oh, बेटा आपने वो स्लाइड नहीं मेरी देखी जो मैंने अभी दिखाई थी कि प्रोफेसर्स को ना रीच आउट करो बिफोर अप्लाइंग. आप उनके स्टूडेंट्स को रीच आउट करो इन ऑर्डर टू डिटरमिन वेदर यू शुड अप्लाई टू देम, but you don't reach out to so many professors at all, right? After you apply, you reach out to them. Are we in a bad place if we don't contact professors before applying? uh, no, not necessarily. It helps tremendously if you have prior introduction to that professor, or if somebody puts in a word for you, right? So for example, if Dr. Junaid says to somebody he's been collaborating with कि यार ये मेरा student है या मेरी student है, ये अच्छी है, इसको रख लो, so that's worth much more than somebody who they don't know anything about, right? So एक trust होता है, एक relationship होती है, उसकी basis पे अगर आपको कोई professor individually recommend कर दे to somebody, that counts for a lot. या फिर अगर आपने उसके साथ पहले काम किया हो या फिर आपकी कोई publication हो उनके साथ, but generally randomly reaching out to a lot of professors is not suitable. It doesn't make sense because you see, देखो, you're one student, you're talking about reaching out to 40 professors. There are 20 of you applying for a PhD. That's 800 professors you're reaching out to, right? And a lot of them will be repeats as well. And then that's just one LUMS, right? So they will be getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails. Um, it is very unlikely that a random email from a random student with no particular reason for contacting them and no way of differentiating themselves from the rest of the people contacting them will help you in your application, right? So don't do that. Reach out to their students, find out about their research, read their research. अगर आपको particularly पसंद आए तो 2-3 प्रोफेसर्स को आप बेशक ईमेल कर दो कि सर आपके ये पेपर्स मैंने पढ़े हैं और इस वजह से मुझे पसंद है और इस चीज पे मेरे ख्याल से मैं और आप अच्छा काम कर सकते हैं आगे, राइट? बट डोंट डू generic emails. Nabil Gulzar, are you by any chance related to Muhammad Ali Gulzar from 2014? Given that I go for PhD after master's with thesis, how does that impact the expected completion time? That's an excellent question. Very good question. So I'll give you my example. My batchmates, a couple of them went for direct masters leading to PhD, right? They got admitted they went at the same time as me, 2015. One of them is about to graduate 2021, which means कि उसको total 6 साल लगे होंगे. The other one is about to graduate in 2022, expected to graduate. So that means उसको total 7 साल लगे होंगे. So about 6 to 7 years for somebody directly after a bachelor's. On the other hand, मैंने 2 साल का मास्टर्स किया. मास्टर्स विद थीसिस आमतौर पे 2 साल का होता है. उसके बाद अगर मैं डायरेक्टली पीएचडी में दाखिला लेता, बेसिकली लम्स के जो 2 साल है बीच में से अगर सब्ट्रैक्ट कर दो, बिकॉज यू कैन सब्ट्रैक्ट दैट, and then I went to a PhD program. अभी मेरा इस PhD program का total expected completion time जो है is anywhere between 4 to 5 years, which means add the 2 years I spent previously, again it's a total of about 6 to 7 years. So I would say it doesn't impact it too much. Maybe a little bit, थोड़ा सा शायद बढ़ाए if you switch, so जैसे मैंने किया, मेरा मास्टर्स किसी और फील्ड में था, किसी और डिपार्टमेंट में था, मेरा पीएचडी किसी और डिपार्टमेंट में है, और एक तो यूनिवर्सिटी भी फर्क है, दूसरा फील्ड भी फर्क है, तो उससे थोड़ा सा मुझे इम्पैक्ट होएगा, बिकॉज इट विल टेक मी मोर टाइम टू गेट अप टू स्पीड टू बी एबल टू मेक द काइंड ऑफ कटिंग एज कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस इन ट्रांसपोर्ट, बिकॉज आई डोंट हैव अ ट्रांसपोर्टेशन बैकग्राउंड, राइट? So that उससे थोड़ा सा impact हो सकता है, मगर there are a lot of other factors that determine the amount of time that it will take. You know, when you get into a bachelor's, you know that it is going to take you 4 years, right? Or most likely going to take you 4 years. When you get into a PhD, it depends a lot on your performance. It depends a lot on your advisor. It depends a lot on your funding. It depends on so many different things that that you can't really, determine. Yeah, you get what I'm saying. Random question. I noticed the nameplate behind you. Who is Zaid Saeed Khan? That's my dad. This is study. I don't have a separate study in my house, so I use my dad's study. About transportation, what background should one have to apply for an MS in transportation? You can have a CS background, you can have a civil engineering background, you can have a operations research background, you can have a data science background, you can have an urban studies background. Transportation is a very um, diverse and interdisciplinary kind of field, and you have people working in it who have all sorts of different backgrounds. Yeah, Nabil, go ahead. I've let you unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a scenario in my circle. A guy applied for PhD after masters from LUMS, and at start his expected time was 5 years. But then he told me something about the exemption of courses, that Colorado State also accepts the courses from LUMS, and now his expected time is 3 years. How does that work?
Okay, so yeah, good question. The point here is that आपका generally if you go for a PhD directly after your bachelor's, right? तो आपका काफी कोर्स वर्क होता है जो कि आपने करना होता है, certain number of credit hours जो कि आपने पूरे करने होते हैं. अगर आप मास्टर्स के बाद जाते हो तो again total number of credit hours that you have to do is the same, but mostly they will count your master's के credit hours as part of as fulfilling that requirement partially, right? So क्या कहते हैं, मिसाल के तौर पे अगर आपने 15 कोर्सेज करने हैं बैचलर्स के बाद, टू गेट अ पीएचडी की रिक्वायरमेंट ये है कि 15 कोर्सेज आपने करने हैं, मास्टर्स में आपने 7 कोर्सेज किए हुए हैं, तो अब आम तौर पे जब आप जाओगे, चाहे वो कहीं और से मास्टर्स करके जाओगे, चाहे उसी यूनिवर्सिटी से जाओगे, वो आपको कहेंगे कि भाई आपने 7 किए हुए, अब आप 8 और करो, राइट? सो दैट डज काउंट mostly. LUMS के count करते हैं, that's good. Not all US universities will accept Pakistani universities credit hours, but some will, and that's good. But अमेरिकी universities के credit hours ज्यादातर लोग जो है वो एक्सेप्ट करेंगे. सो मिसाल के तौर पे मैं अभी गया हूँ मास्टर्स के बाद पीएचडी करने, मुझे उन्होंने कहा कि बेटा आपने 7 कोर्सेज करने हैं, ठीक है? जो बंदा इसी प्रोग्राम में बैचलर्स के बाद डायरेक्ट गया है, उसको उन्होंने कहा कि बेटा आपने 15 कोर्सेज करने हैं, राइट? सो दैट उस लिहाज से आपको को बहुत ज्यादा लॉस नहीं होता, क्रेडिट आवर्स आपके जाया नहीं होते, कह लो, जो आपने मास्टर्स में लिए हो, ठीक है? Do you have another question or yeah, Ayaz, you can go next. Yeah, by the way, anybody who's pressed for time, feel free to leave because now it's just Q&A, right? So those who are interested in these questions, you can stay. Anybody else who wants to go, you can go.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Can you hear me?
Walaikum salam. Yeah.
जी सर, जिस तरह हम लम्स के अंदर 4 साल के अंदर जो CS पढ़ते हैं वो तो एक्चुअली 3 साल पढ़ते हैं, तो वी डोंट गेट द फ्लेवर ऑफ एवरी फील्ड. लाइक अभी जिस तरह हमारे बैच का प्रोग्राम एनालिसिस नहीं पढ़ सके थे स्टूडेंट्स, तो अब हम अगर एक PhD के लिए चले जाते हैं और हम एक स्पेसिफिक किसी सॉफ्टवेयर इंजीनियरिंग या प्रोग्राम लैंग्वेजेस की तरफ निकलते हैं, फिर बाद में हमारा लगता है कि नहीं, प्रोग्राम एनालिसिस ज्यादा इंटरेस्ट आ रही है मुझे, तो वो प्रोफेसर या जो हम अपने डायरेक्शन ऑफ रिसर्च चेंज करते हैं, उसका कितना कोई इम्पैक्ट आता है उस पे, क्योंकि हम अभी BS के बाद तो डायरेक्ट जा रहे होते हैं.
Right, that's a very good question, excellent question. उसमें 2-3 चीजें ये है कि that is one of the reasons why I and most other people who are actually doing a PhD would suggest to you that before doing a PhD, try to get a flavor of what you like. And you can do that by taking more courses in a master's program. If you do a master's, obviously you'll take a number of other courses, you'll study certain fields in more depth, and you'll also get a broader idea of the other fields that exist in CS and the other opportunities that you have. Because to be honest, LUMS gives you a pretty skewed idea of what kind of fields are available and options are available based on the strengths that LUMS as a department, CS department has, which would be the case for any other university as well. But once you do a master's, you've done a lot more courses, you have an idea, much better idea of the options that are available to you, then you can make a more informed and better decision about which of those options you want to actually pursue for a PhD. एक तो ये बात होगी. दूसरा ये कि क्या कहते हैं, अगर आप मास्टर्स लीडिंग टू PhD के लिए जाओ, उसमें आप कोर्स वर्क लो और 1 साल बाद आपको लगे कि भाई नहीं मैंने चेंज करना है, तो उस वक्त आप चेंज कर सकते हो सकता है आपको थोड़ा बहुत सेटबैक हो सकता है आपको 1 आधा साल एक्स्ट्रा लग जाए अगर आपने एडवाइजर चेंज किया. 1-1.5 साल तक अगर आप एडवाइजर चेंज करते हो तो कोई बहुत ज़्यादा फर्क नहीं पड़ता, बहुत ज़्यादा नुकसान नहीं होता, बिकॉज पहले 1-1.5 साल में आप वैसे ही कोर्स वर्क ज़्यादा कर रहे होते हो, रिसर्च कम कर रहे होते हो या ना होने के बराबर कर रहे होते हो, तो इसलिए आप उतनी देर आपके पास होती है. सो इवन इफ यू हैव चोजन एन एडवाइजर and for some reason, for whatever reason, you don't get along with that advisor, or you don't find an interest in that area, and you want to switch advisors, and you're willing to find somebody else at that university, some other professor who wants to take you, then you can switch without, typically you can switch without too much of an impact. ठीक है?
Thank you.
Yeah, Nabil, is your hand raised from your previous question, or do you have another question? Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Anybody has anything else to ask?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, हम जब LUMS में काम करते हैं तो many of us have either like if we got engaged in research early तो हम करते थे software में, हमने किसी से कहा, we reached out, people gave us projects, लेकिन obviously as a soft they didn't expect us to do a lot, so that's not a major contribution in any way, so we just got a taste of research but we didn't contribute. Similarly, we did some course projects and all, but contributions, yeah, is it better to have like small projects with little contribution like this, and should this be mentioned in our PhD applications, or should we just focus on the large contributions we have?
That's a good question. You're talking about your SOP mainly, right? So, क्या कहते हैं? It depends. If you're applying in a particular area which is different from the one that you worked on for your senior project, and you have a small project in that area, so then you should definitely highlight that and mention that and say that, this is why, this is how I got a flavor of this area, and I liked it, and that's why I want to go more into this, right? So that forms part of your motivation in your SOP, as well as your demonstration of interest and so on. Otherwise, if you're जो आपने सीनियर प्रोजेक्ट पे काम किया उसी चीज पे आगे काम करना चाह रहे हैं, so then I wouldn't really mention in a lot of detail the other projects that I've done. I think at this point after a bachelor's you don't really have too much meat to put in your SOP, and therefore एक वो फिलर के तौर पे बाकी प्रोजेक्ट्स जिन पे आपने काम किया हुआ है वो आप डालो, खास तौर पे अगर वो उन लोगों के साथ हैं जो लोग आपकी रिकमेंडेशन लिख रहे हैं, तो थोड़ा बहुत उसका जिक्र करो, ठीक है?
Similarly, some of the instructors tell us that TA-ships की इतनी importance नहीं होती because a lot of people have TA-ships, but in PhD and Masters, if you're applying for TA-ships, should we mention that and highlight those in our SOP and resume, basically?
No, sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't quite understand.
Sir, I just wanted to know how good of a thing or how bad of a thing either ways is our TA-ships on our applications? Like, what
it's
effect
good.
do they have?
Of course, it's very good. TA-ship is always a good positive thing to have on your application. Number one, it shows that some instructor at your university trusted you enough to make you a TA. Number two, it shows that you therefore have the experience of doing a TA-ship. And number three, if you're saying in your SOP that one of your motivations is teaching, so then you have demonstrated interest and experience in that. And number four, you're going to end up doing a PhD anywhere, so doing a TA-ship anyway at some point in your PhD. So it shows that you already know how to do that. So it's a good thing. So CV पे तो definitely लिखना चाहिए. और क्या लिखोगे? आपके पास बहुत ज़्यादा चीजें तो है नहीं लिखने को for in your CV. So you're definitely going to write TA-ships in your CV. I would mention them in your SOP as well. Yeah, probably would. Yeah. Anything else, anybody? Yeah, so I'll if there's no other questions, we can end now. I'll share these slides with LWiC, and they can forward it to you guys. You guys can reach out if you have any questions later on as well. ठीक है, PhD करो अगर, so if you know what you're getting into and why you're getting into it, and there's a particular reason, right? So I shared this last time as well. My motivation is mainly that I want to be in academia, I want to be in university, I want to be around young people and helping them out, and that's why I want to do a PhD. And there has to be you have to have a long-term goal and vision in mind that gets you through it. Otherwise, it's a very tedious process to go through. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.